Welcome. Let's start. Segment 1. The Puppet Strings. You can't see Imagine standing in a dimly lit theater surrounded by an audience you can't quite make out. On stage is a marionette, a beautifully crafted wooden figure dancing gracefully to the rhythm of unseen hands above. The strings that control its every movement are invisible from your seat. All you see is the illusion of autonomy. Now consider this. What if you're not in the audience at all? What if you're the puppet? This unsettling metaphor captures one of psychology's darkest truths. Much of what we believe to be free will is in fact dictated by forces beyond our conscious awareness. These puppet strings aren't tangible or visible. They're woven from biases, societal conditioning, emotional triggers, and deeply ingrained habits. They guide us through life without us even realizing it. And yet, despite their invisibility, they shape nearly everything we do. Think about the last decision you made. Maybe it was something small like choosing what to eat for breakfast, or something significant like accepting a job offer. Did you arrive at that choice entirely on your own? Or were you influenced by subtle cues, advertisements you didn't notice, cultural expectations you've internalized, or emotions lingering from yesterday's argument with a friend? Psychologists have long studied how these external and internal factors manipulate our decisions, often without us being aware of it. Take confirmation bias, for instance. This cognitive shortcut leads us to seek out information that aligns with our existing beliefs, while ignoring evidence that contradicts them. It's as though we're walking around with blinders on, only seeing what confirms our preconceived notions. But here's the twist: we don't realize we're wearing those blinders. To us, it feels like we're making rational, objective decisions, when in reality we're cherry-picking data to support whatever narrative suits us best. Or consider the power of priming. In experiments, researchers have shown that exposing people to certain words or images, even subliminally, can dramatically influence their behavior. For example, participants who were briefly shown words associated with old age, like wrinkles or gray hair, walked more slowly afterward. They had no idea why they were moving differently. They simply felt compelled to do so. These subconscious nudges happen constantly in everyday life, shaping how we act, think, and feel without us ever noticing. But perhaps the most insidious string of all is the one tied to social conformity. Human beings are inherently social creatures, wired to crave acceptance and belonging. This need for connection makes us highly susceptible to groupthink, the tendency to adopt the opinions and behaviors of those around us, even when they conflict with our own values. Consider the famous Asch conformity experiments, where participants knowingly gave incorrect answers to match the majority opinion, simply because everyone else did. Their reasoning wasn't logical; it was driven by an unconscious desire to fit in. Now let's take a step back and reflect on the implications of living under such invisible influences. If so much of our behavior is predetermined by these hidden forces, does free will truly exist? Philosophers and psychologists have debated this question for centuries, but the answer remains elusive. Some argue that recognizing these puppet strings gives us a degree of agency. We may not be able to cut them entirely, but we can at least become aware of their pull. Awareness, after all, is the first step toward change. Consider how this concept touches every corner of our existence, from the political beliefs we adopt, to the fashion trends we follow, to the people we choose to love or avoid. So many of these decisions are less personal than they appear. We inherit scripts, roles, and reactions from our environment, and most of the time we play them out unconsciously. Yet we cling to the illusion of authorship, convinced that we are writing our own lines. But perhaps there's a strange comfort in knowing we're not alone in shaping our paths. These invisible strings don't just constrain us, they connect us to culture, to history, to each other. They are the soft threads of influence that make us legible to the world and to ourselves. And sometimes, in understanding how we're shaped, we discover how to reshape ourselves. Imagine catching yourself mid-thought and wondering, where did this belief come from? Imagine hearing your own inner voice and realizing it sounds a lot like a parent, a teacher, or a commercial. These moments, though fleeting, are portals. They offer you a glimpse behind the curtain. And each glimpse is a small act of liberation. Language itself is one such string. Every word we use is handed down to us. The way we construct meaning is bound to the structures we've inherited, and yet within those structures we can express infinite nuance. The constraints become tools. The puppet learns to choreograph. This is the paradox we live in, shaped and shaping, moved and moving, influenced and influencing. And the more we recognize the forces that act upon us, the more we begin to act with intention. This doesn't eliminate the strings, but it changes the dance. And so we return to that marionette on the stage. It may be controlled, yes, but what if it's also aware? What if it learns the rhythms well enough to play with them? What if the beauty isn't in cutting the strings, but in learning how to move with them, gracefully, deliberately, with understanding and compassion? This is not a story of despair. It's an invitation to look closer, to question gently, to notice your thoughts, your habits, your emotions, not as flaws but as inherited choreography. And from there to decide what to keep and what to rewrite. Because the strings don't go away. But awareness changes everything. And speaking of mechanisms, let's turn our attention to another invisible force that shapes human behavior, learned helplessness. Why do some people remain trapped in situations they could easily escape, convinced there's no way out? Segment 2. Learned helplessness. The cage with no lock picture. A dog in a metal box. The floor delivers occasional, unpredictable electric shocks. There's no escape, no way to stop them. The dog whimpers, panics, searches desperately for a solution, but nothing works. Eventually, it stops trying. It just lies there, accepting the pain as inevitable. The gate opens, the shocks continue, but the dog stays still. It doesn't even attempt to leave. This haunting image is not metaphor. It was part of a real experiment in the 1960s by psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Mayer. What they discovered came to be known as learned helplessness, a psychological phenomenon where individuals who experience repeated failure or punishment in response to their efforts eventually give up trying, even when change becomes possible. The original trap conditions the mind to stop seeking freedom. In humans, the effects are far more subtle and far-reaching. It might begin in childhood, growing up in a home where nothing you do seems to please a parent. Or perhaps you try over and over again to find meaningful work, but every opportunity seems to slip through your fingers. Or maybe you keep entering relationships where your needs aren't met, and after a while, you convince yourself that it's just your fate, that you're unlovable, that things won't ever change. Over time, we internalize the message, "Nothing I do matters," and that message becomes a lens through which we interpret everything. Even when new chances appear, we hesitate. Even when a door opens, we don't walk through it. The cage may be gone, but the memory of it remains. We carry it in our bodies, in our reactions, in our silence. This is the terrifying power of learned helplessness. It makes failure feel like destiny. It's no longer just something that happened. It becomes who we are. And in that quiet, persistent resignation, we stop reaching, stop asking, stop believing, not because we're weak, but because we've been trained. There's another layer to this trick. Once helplessness sets in, it's self-reinforcing. We stop trying, so we miss opportunities for success. The lack of success confirms the belief that nothing works, and the belief fuels further inaction. A silent spiral, so slow and suffocating that we often don't realize we're sinking. It creeps into language. I can't. What's the point? That's just how it is. Phrases that seem casual, but carry deep resignation. Phrases that signal the loss of agency, because that's what learned helplessness steals, your sense of power, your belief in change. And when an entire community shares this condition, it becomes cultural, generational. Entire neighborhoods, schools, or families can fall into cycles where ambition is mocked, where hope is seen as naive, where surviving is the best anyone can hope for. Not because they lack strength, but because they've been taught that trying leads nowhere. The darkness of learned helplessness is not always loud. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It waits. It shows up in small decisions, in someone who no longer applies for a job because they assume rejection, in a student who stops raising their hand because they expect to be wrong, in a parent who no longer disciplines their child because nothing ever seems to change. It wears many masks, but its message is always the same: don't bother. And yet there's a quiet rebellion in awareness, because just as helplessness is learned, it can be unlearned. The process isn't instant, it doesn't come with grand gestures. It starts with the smallest flicker of possibility, the subtle shift from why try to what if it works this time. Sometimes, we need someone else to believe in us before we can believe in ourselves. Sometimes, it takes a safe space, a gentle nudge, a different kind of mirror. The nervous system, once trained into submission, needs consistent signals that it is no longer in danger, that it is okay to move, to hope, to act. Therapists, teachers, mentors, even kind strangers can be the catalyst. The first time someone listens and doesn't dismiss you, the first time you take a step and don't fail. These moments chip away at the illusion. They remind you that the rules you've been living by were never universal laws, just echoes of old pain. Reclaiming agency is not about conquering the world. It's about choosing something different, one moment at a time. It's about remembering that you are still capable of choice. Even if the choices are small, even if the first attempts are clumsy, it is about honoring the effort, not just the result. There's also power in forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, to look at your past and say, I did the best I could with what I had, and now I'm ready for more. That is not weakness, that is strength born from survival. That is what healing sounds like. Learned helplessness doesn't mean you are broken. It means you were shaped by something that made survival feel safer than risk. And now, with time and support, you can learn something new, something freer, something more aligned with who you truly are beneath the fear. So take a moment now, breathe, and ask yourself, where have you already stopped trying, and why? What part of you believes it's safer to stay still than to risk one more disappointment? What cage are you still sitting in, even though the lock has rusted away? Let that question stay with you as we continue. Because in the next segment, we turn to something just as powerful: the lies we tell ourselves to survive. Not to deceive others, but to protect our most fragile truths. Segment 3. The Mirror Trick. Self-deception as survival. You look in the mirror and see someone you think you know. A face, familiar yet curated. Eyes that reflect something, but perhaps not everything. Behind that expression lies a quiet trick, one we all perform, often without knowing it. We don't just deceive others, we deceive ourselves. Self-deception is one of the most subtle and unsettling psychological mechanisms. Unlike lies told to others, which often carry the weight of intention, self-deception runs deeper. It's not merely a choice to look away from truth. It's the quiet rewriting of memory, motive, and meaning. It is survival disguised as clarity. Why do we do it? Because the truth is sharp. It cuts into the soft parts of who we are. If we believe we are good, but our actions suggest otherwise, that contradiction burns. The mind cannot tolerate such discomfort for long, so it adjusts. Not by changing what we did, but by changing how we remember it. Psychologists call this dissonance reduction. When who we are and what we do don't match, we shift the story. We edit our memories, add justification, remove blame. We construct an internal narrative that allows us to sleep at night. And the most extraordinary part, we believe it. This belief isn't fabricated maliciously. It's born from emotional necessity. The human psyche is built for coherence. We need to feel like we are consistent, stable, in control. When something threatens that coherence, our mind reaches for narrative tools, and those tools often look like subtle lies. Take, for example, the person who ends a friendship harshly, but later remembers themselves as being calm and fair. Or the employee who cuts corners, but recalls it as being resourceful under pressure. Or the partner who withdraws emotionally, but tells themselves it was the only way to protect the relationship. These aren't just post-hoc rationalizations, they become the new truth. What's dangerous is how convincing the story becomes. Once we internalize it, we stop questioning it. We reinforce it through repetition. We may even retell the story to others, solidifying it further. And if someone challenges it, we feel attacked, not because they're wrong, but because they threaten the scaffolding of our psychological safety. But not all self-deception is about memory. Sometimes it's about identity. We may build a self-image that feels noble or resilient, even if it's hollow. The overachiever who is driven not by ambition, but by a need to escape childhood shame. The peacemaker who avoids conflict, not out of wisdom, but out of fear. These personas are masks we wear not to fool the world, but to convince ourselves we are okay. And sometimes, self-deception keeps us from healing. If we believe our trauma didn't affect us, we don't seek help. If we convince ourselves we're fine, we don't confront what's been buried. Denial becomes armor, but also a prison. Because healing can only happen in truth, and self-deception hides the wounds. So why do we continue to do it? Because facing truth is painful. Because admitting our flaws risks shame. Because pulling apart the stories we live in is destabilizing. Yet there is power on the other side of that unraveling. When we begin to notice our inner editing, we unlock the potential for self-compassion. We realize that our distortions weren't failures. They were protections. We didn't lie to be evil. We lied to stay whole. That is the paradox of self-deception. It is a form of care, misapplied. Imagine standing again before the mirror. This time, instead of seeing a version of yourself that is clean, complete, and curated, you let the image blur. You let the light hit the cracks. You let the contradictions rise. And you do not flinch. That is the beginning of inner clarity. It's not about becoming perfectly honest all the time. It's about noticing when you're shaping the narrative and asking why. It's about pausing before you excuse a behavior and considering what deeper truth you might be avoiding. It's about giving yourself permission to see things as they are, not to punish yourself, but to understand. This process takes courage. It takes patience. And most of all, it takes gentleness. Because beneath every self-deception lies something tender. A shame we couldn't bear. A need we couldn't name. A fear we didn't know how to soothe. When we meet those parts with kindness, the need for deception begins to fade. We don't have to pretend we were perfect. We can hold our mistakes with accountability and grace. We can update our story without erasing the truth. And in doing so, we become more whole, not less. So take a breath now. Think of a story you often tell yourself. One that paints you in a forgiving light. One that might not be entirely false, but feels suspiciously smooth. Ask yourself, what might I be hiding from myself? What truth have I softened to make it easier to carry? This is not an invitation to judge yourself. It is an invitation to gently unmask, to peel back one layer at a time, to remember that seeing clearly is not about self-condemnation, it's about self-connection. Because when we stop lying to ourselves, even softly, we begin to trust ourselves again. And that trust becomes the ground from which everything else grows. Let's walk carefully now into the next shadow, a distortion that comes not from within, but from what we project onto others. When admiration turns into blindness, when charm conceals danger, when we fall for the illusion of goodness. Segment 4. The halo effect. The angel, in disguise, a kind face, a confident voice, a gentle smile, and suddenly, you trust them. Maybe you even admire them. But what if that charm is just a mask? Picture a soft light in a dark room. It doesn't illuminate everything, just enough to focus your gaze. That's how the halo effect works. It draws your attention to one shining feature and lets everything else dissolve into a blur. In that blur, we make assumptions, form attachments, and ignore inconsistencies. The glow becomes a truth all its own. The halo effect is not simply a misjudgment. It's a mirage woven by the mind's longing for coherence. When we encounter someone with a positive quality, physical beauty, charisma, fame, or confidence, we unconsciously extend that quality across their entire character. An attractive person must also be trustworthy. A successful speaker must also be wise. A generous friend must also be right. But these assumptions are rarely questioned because they feel so natural, so intuitive. Psychologist Edward Thorndike first observed this distortion in military evaluations. When officers rated their soldiers highly in one area, like physical appearance, they also rated them higher in unrelated traits, like intelligence and leadership. The ratings weren't based on performance, they were based on the glow. What makes this trick so dangerous is its subtlety. You don't feel yourself being fooled, you feel like you're perceiving clearly. And that's what makes it so enduring. The halo effect survives scrutiny because it rarely invites any. In everyday life, this effect shapes countless decisions. Teachers unknowingly grade attractive students more favorably. Job candidates who dress well are seen as more competent. Jurors show leniency to charming defendants. And in relationships, the most vulnerable arena of all, we often fall not for the whole person, but for the part that shines brightest. But a glow is not a person, it's a projection, and when the projection collapses, it leaves a strange silence. We look at someone we once admired and wonder how we ever believed in them so deeply. The betrayal is sharp, not just because they let us down, but because we let ourselves believe. We ignored the shadows, we lit them up with borrowed light. The halo effect also affects how we perceive ourselves. We cling to a compliment, a success, a positive trait, and build our identity around it. It becomes the thing we polish, protect, and present. But in doing so, we risk ignoring the rest. The messier truths. The work we still need to do. And when someone questions our halo, we feel threatened, not because we are false, but because we've tied our worth to the shine. Social media amplifies this distortion. Every post is curated, every image edited, every caption sharpened to impress. The halo becomes a brand, not just a bias. We scroll past strangers who seem flawless, forgetting that we're looking at illusions. Their success, their serenity, their glow, all engineered. But we don't see the editing. We see the light. And we compare it to our raw, unfiltered lives. Even institutions are not immune. We trust brands, political figures, even belief systems, not because of their content, but because of their glow. A cause championed by someone we admire must be just. A philosophy quoted by a beloved thinker must be true. This is not logic, this is longing dressed as perception. And sometimes, the glow becomes dangerous. Charismatic manipulators use their halo to deflect scrutiny. Cult leaders inspire loyalty, not because of truth, but because of presence. Abusive partners maintain control not through violence alone, but through charm. The light they emit is blinding, and it keeps us from seeing the harm they do. But the halo effect is not all deception and doom. At its heart, it's a reflection of something deeply human. The desire to simplify complexity. The mind is overwhelmed by detail. It craves shortcuts, and the halo is just that. A shortcut to certainty. But certainty is rarely truthful. It's comforting, and comfort, while sweet, can also sedate. To begin dissolving this illusion, we must first slow down. Notice when admiration appears. Pause when trust flows too easily. Ask yourself, what am I responding to? Is it the whole person, or just the part that shines? Is it truth, or the shape of a story I want to believe? Awareness is not cynicism, it's clarity. When we learn to see the halo, we're not tearing people down, we're seeing them fully. With their light and their shadow, their grace and their flaws. That kind of seeing is not cold, it's compassionate. And sometimes, when we look more closely, we find something better than the illusion. We find real people, not saints or devils, just humans. And there's something sacred in that. In loving without projection, in trusting without blindness, in admiring without losing discernment. So take a breath. Think of someone you've placed on a pedestal. What do you truly know about them? What have you assumed, and what would it feel like to see them clearly? Not more, not less, but truly. The light that blinds can also reveal. The key is where you choose to look. Now let's shift our gaze to the next shadow. Because some illusions don't come from admiration, they come from exposure. From the feeling that others can see into us, even when we say nothing. Segment 5. The illusion of transparency. They don't know what you're thinking. You walk into a room and feel exposed, as if everyone can see straight through you, into your thoughts, your nervousness, your self-doubt. You smile, trying to mask it, but you're sure they can tell. You feel as though your emotions are radiating off your skin. But here's the strange part. They aren't. Not nearly as much as you think. This is the illusion of transparency, a psychological trick where we overestimate how much our internal states are apparent to others. We believe people can sense our fear, read our discomfort, and pick up on the tremor in our voice or the guilt behind our eyes. But in reality, most people are far too consumed by their own thoughts to notice the subtle cues we think we're broadcasting. This illusion emerges from a very human tendency. We are trapped in our own perspective. Because we feel our emotions so vividly, we assume they must be equally visible to others. But our internal intensity doesn't leak out as clearly as we think. To the outside world, our storm may look like a gentle breeze or nothing at all. Psychological studies confirm this disconnect. In one experiment, participants were asked to lie or tell the truth and then estimate how transparent they were. Most liars believed their deceit was obvious, but observers guessed no better than chance. This suggests that even when we feel guilty, ashamed, or afraid, others may have no idea. And yet, we continue to feel watched, judged, exposed. This becomes especially intense during public speaking, first dates, job interviews, or moments of vulnerability. Our heart pounds, palms sweat, voice trembles, and we believe everyone notices. But they don't. They're busy managing their own invisible performances. The illusion of transparency doesn't just fuel anxiety, it shapes how we interact with others, especially when we're hurting. When we feel sad or frustrated, we often assume the people close to us should just know. We wait for them to ask what's wrong. We wait for them to comfort us. And when they don't, we feel abandoned, not because they were careless, but because they didn't read what was never clearly said. This leads to resentment, miscommunication, distance. We expect empathy to be intuitive. We think love should come with mind reading. But connection, real connection, requires more than silent hope. It requires expression. It requires words. When we assume others know what we're feeling, we abandon clarity. We replace communication with passive expectation. And when those expectations aren't met, we blame them. Or worse, we blame ourselves. We spiral into thoughts like, if they really cared, they would have noticed. But maybe they didn't see. Maybe they were lost in their own fog. This isn't just a romantic problem. It seeps into friendships, families, even professional environments. We avoid direct conversations, hoping body language or tone will carry the message. But it rarely does, and so, emotions fester unspoken. Needs go unmet. And people drift apart, not because they didn't care, but because no one said what needed to be heard. There's also a subtler cost. When we believe we're being constantly evaluated, we become less authentic. We censor ourselves, shrink our presence, rehearse our every word. We live under an invisible spotlight, always adjusting to the imagined gaze of others. But in doing so, we lose something real, the ease of being seen without performance. Ironically, the more we believe we're being seen clearly, the less we reveal who we truly are. We hide behind perfect phrasing, polite smiles, and curated emotions, assuming everyone is already reading the subtext. But most of the time, they're not. Most of the time, they're just trying to be seen too. What if we accepted that our inner world is not transparent? What if we assumed, as a rule, that people don't know how we feel, unless we tell them? This shift doesn't make us invisible. It makes us responsible. It invites us to articulate rather than expect, to clarify rather than assume. There is deep power in simple truths. In saying, "I'm nervous," in admitting, I need help, in whispering, I'm hurting, and I don't know how to say it. These admissions strip away the illusion. They allow others to meet us in our truth, not in our performance. And there is also freedom. When we stop assuming others can see our flaws, our fears, our doubts, we stop performing for an invisible audience. We can speak more plainly, move more freely, live more fully, because we're no longer trapped in the theater of imagined judgment. So tonight, ask yourself, where have you expected someone to know how you feel without ever saying it aloud? Where have you performed for a gaze that might not even exist? And what might change if you gave yourself permission to be clearer, softer, braver, with your words, your needs, your truth? The illusion of transparency is just that, an illusion. And once you see it, you can step outside it. You can begin to relate not through assumption, but through intention, through conscious connection. And now let us move forward, because sometimes it's not what we believe others can see, but what we assume they can't. Segment 6. When we assume they know, the silent expectation trap. Imagine sitting beside someone you love, the silence thick between you. You ache for them to notice your sadness, to reach for your hand, to ask what's wrong, but they don't. And so the ache turns inward, not because they were cruel, but because they couldn't hear the storm you never voiced. This is the silent expectation trap, one of the quietest, most insidious psychological illusions. It begins with the belief that those closest to us should just know. That real connection means reading signals, deciphering moods, feeling our pain without explanation. And when they fail to do so, we don't just feel misunderstood, we feel betrayed. It's a haunting paradox. We long for intimacy, for that wordless understanding that makes us feel truly known. But instead of revealing ourselves, we hide behind hope. We assume. We wait. We grow cold with unspoken need, and still we whisper to ourselves, if they really loved me, they'd see. But they don't see, not because they don't care, but because they're not mind readers. They are caught up in their own inner monologues, their own unspoken storms. They are guessing, just like we are. And sometimes their guesses fall short. This illusion is born from the same cognitive distortion as the illusion of transparency. We believe our feelings are obvious, that our sighs, our silences, our distance should speak for themselves. But what we interpret as clear signals are often quiet static to others. They hear noise, not meaning. They see distance, not distress. It becomes a loop of misinterpretation. You feel hurt, so you withdraw, hoping they'll chase you. They see you pulling away and assume you need space, so they give it. You interpret their absence as indifference, and in that widening gap, two people fall further apart, each believing the other has failed. The pain here isn't just about unmet needs, it's about unspoken stories. We carry scripts in our heads of how love should look, how comfort should arrive, how empathy should manifest. But we rarely share those scripts. And so we live in parallel plays, never knowing what act the other is performing. Sometimes, we even punish people for not knowing what we never told them. We build resentments, we create emotional distance, we test them subtly or dramatically to see if they'll figure it out. But the tests are unfair. The rules were never explained. The answers were never given. It's important to understand where this illusion comes from. It is not manipulative. It's protective. We don't want to ask for what we need because we fear rejection. We don't want to name our sadness because we fear it will be minimized. We don't want to say, I need you because we fear we'll seem needy. And so we fold our vulnerability into silence and then grieve when no one hears it. But connection requires risk. It asks us to name what we need, even when our voice trembles. It invites us to clarify, not because the other person is careless, but because they are human. They cannot love what we hide. They cannot soothe what we mask. The truth is, we all walk through life with invisible wounds. And most people are so busy tending to their own, they rarely see yours unless you show them. That doesn't make them cruel. It makes them like you. aching to be understood, uncertain how to begin. There is bravery in saying, "I'm not okay." There is strength in saying, "I wanted you to notice." There is healing in saying, "I don't expect you to fix this, but I need you to hear me." These small, courageous acts break the silence. They teach others how to love you, not perfectly, but intentionally. And there is also freedom, because once you let go of the idea that people should just know, you reclaim your voice. You stop waiting. You start asking. You stop punishing silence and start building bridges across it. This shift doesn't make you needy. It makes you honest. It makes you a participant in your own relationships. It makes you real. So tonight, as you reflect, ask yourself, where have you been waiting to be seen without showing yourself? Where have you hoped someone would understand without being told? What might change if you risk speaking instead of expecting? The silent expectation trap feeds on secrecy, but connection grows in clarity. When we speak our truth, even awkwardly, even haltingly, we invite others into our world. We stop testing, and we start trusting. And in doing so, we may discover something unexpected, that people are more willing to meet our needs than we feared. That love deepens when it's guided. That care becomes clearer when we clear the fog. So let this be the breath that breaks the silence. Let this be the pause where the unspoken becomes spoken. Because now, we step into another illusion, one where feelings leap between people without words, shaping behavior, spreading like fire, invisible and contagious. Segment 7. Emotional Contagion. How feelings jump without words. Picture a candle lighting another. No sound, no words, just fire, passed from wick to wick, a subtle flicker, a silent spark. In that brief moment, something invisible is shared, not seen, not heard, but felt. That's how emotions move. They travel, not through language, but through presence. And when they do, they change the atmosphere of a room. A single sigh, a tight jaw, a nervous glance. These are the small cues that tell our nervous systems something is happening here. This is emotional contagion, the process by which one person's feelings ripple into another's without either of them needing to speak. It's not manipulation, and it's not empathy in its purest form. It's something older, something embedded in our biology. A primitive form of communication that predates language. Before we could speak, we could feel each other. You've felt it, sitting next to someone anxious, and soon you feel anxious too. Being around someone joyful, and without knowing why, your own mood lifts. Emotional contagion doesn't ask permission. It doesn't check whether it's welcome. It just spreads. And once it starts moving, it's hard to stop. This happens because we are wired to attune. Mirror neurons in our brain activate when we observe someone else's expression or behavior. If we see someone smile, our brain simulates that smile. If we hear someone crying, our body softens. Our biology prepares us to match what we witness. This capacity helped early humans survive. Synchrony meant safety. Feeling what others felt made the tribe stronger. But today, this same mechanism can be overwhelming. In crowded spaces, we absorb emotional residue. In relationships, we carry tension that isn't ours. In workplaces, one person's bad mood infects an entire team. And the most unsettling part, we don't always realize it's happening. We think it's our feeling. We claim it. We act on it. All the while we're simply echoing someone else's internal weather. The emotional climate of our environment can shape us in invisible ways. Spend enough time with pessimism, and hope begins to dim. Spend enough time around chaos, and your own nervous system becomes brittle. Emotional contagion doesn't always arrive as intensity. Sometimes it creeps in softly. The low hum of stress, the quiet echo of insecurity, the subtle withdrawal of joy. This creates a strange challenge. How do we discern what's ours and what's borrowed? How do we protect our emotional boundaries in a world that trades in unspoken feelings? The first step is awareness. Learning to pause and ask, is this mine? Did I feel this before I walked into the room? Did something shift after I spoke to that person? Awareness doesn't stop the spread, but it gives us space. And in that space, we can choose. We can choose not to absorb. We can choose to anchor in our own breath, our own truth, our own rhythm. It's not about becoming cold or detached. It's about staying grounded in a storm of signals. But emotional contagion isn't always destructive. Sometimes it heals. A calm presence can soothe a frantic mind. A steady gaze can invite someone back into their body. A gentle tone can dissolve tension before it takes root. We can offer emotions to others without even realizing it. Safety, peace, joy. The quieter energies have just as much power to spread. That is why cultivating your own emotional presence matters. It's not selfish, it's service. When you regulate yourself, you offer stability to others. When you carry softness, you invite others to exhale. We are always in transmission. The only question is, what are we spreading? Think of a moment when someone's energy changed yours. Maybe it was a stranger's kindness in a grocery store. Maybe it was a friend's laughter during a dark time. Maybe it was someone who sat with you in silence, their calm helping you return to yourself. These are sacred exchanges, and they happen all the time if we're paying attention. But the inverse is also true. We have all been the ones who spread tension, fear, or frustration, not out of cruelty, but out of pain. Our nervous systems cry out, and the people around us adjust. They brace, they withdraw, they change, not because we asked them to, but because they felt us before we spoke. So ask yourself tonight, what energy do you bring into a room? What feeling follows you into silence? What ripple do you leave in others after your words are gone? Emotional contagion reminds us of the quiet power we carry. It teaches us that connection is not always conscious, that feeling is a language too, and that we affect others, even when we say nothing at all. Let this awareness humble you. Let it inspire you to carry your emotions with care, not to suppress them but to honor their impact, to notice the waves you send and the ones you receive. And now let's look deeper, because sometimes we don't just absorb emotion, we assume everyone shares our reality. Segment 8. The false consensus trap. Everyone thinks like me. Right. You stand on a crowded street, watching people walk past, each one absorbed in their own world, their own rhythm, their own thoughts. And yet, a quiet part of you assumes, surely they see the world like I do. Surely they think the same things, feel the same frustrations, share the same sense of what is obvious. This silent assumption drifts beneath the surface of your awareness, invisible, yet quietly directing how you interpret the world. This is the false consensus effect, a cognitive illusion that leads us to believe that our thoughts, values, and choices are far more common than they truly are. It's the quiet belief that most people agree with me. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It colors how we argue, how we relate, how we vote, how we judge. And perhaps most dangerously, it gives us comfort. Because if everyone sees things the way we do, we don't have to question ourselves. We don't have to examine the foundations of our beliefs. We don't have to sit with uncertainty. But what if they don't see it that way? What if your truth is just one of many? What if your moral compass, your logic, your outrage are not universal, but deeply personal? What if the consensus you imagined was never real? Psychological studies have shown this effect time and time again. When asked their opinion on a subject, whether it's political, ethical, or personal, participants consistently overestimate how many others share their view. And not just slightly. They believe their perspective is the norm, the default, the rational conclusion. And if someone disagrees, then that person must be misinformed, irrational, or extreme. This illusion is not about arrogance. It's about proximity. We surround ourselves, often unconsciously, with people who reflect our worldview. Our news feeds, social circles, online communities, they echo what we already believe. And in that echo chamber, dissent fades, repetition becomes evidence. Agreement becomes proof, and it happens subtly. You laugh at a joke and assume everyone else would too. You see a news headline and assume it enrages everyone else the same way. You form an opinion, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet voice says that's just common sense. But common sense isn't always common. It's shaped by culture, by upbringing, by identity. What feels obvious to you may be invisible, or even offensive, to someone else. But agreement does not equal truth. And the moment we forget that, we stop listening. We stop asking. We stop being curious about the experiences of others. The false consensus effect makes us blind to diversity of thought. It lulls us into thinking our reality is the reality. That our anger is justified because everyone feels this way. That our choices are logical because most people would agree. That our discomfort is valid because any sane person would feel the same. And this illusion leads to division. Because when we assume consensus, disagreement feels like betrayal. Dissent feels like danger. Instead of seeing difference as natural, we see it as a threat. We forget that other minds are other worlds. This isn't just an intellectual error. It's emotional. Because wrapped in this illusion is a deep longing. The longing to be validated, to feel that we are right, that we are not alone, that we belong. And so when someone challenges our view, it's not just disagreement, it feels like rejection. It strikes at our sense of self. To break this illusion requires humility. Not the performance of humility, but the lived, quiet kind. The kind that admits, I might be wrong. That asks, what haven't I seen? That listens not to reply, but to understand. It also requires presence. To sit across from someone whose views differ from yours, and remain open. To resist the urge to categorize, to pathologize, to dismiss. To remember that their story is shaped by experiences you've never lived. To accept that even your deepest convictions may not be universal truths, but localized beliefs, reflections of your past, not necessarily a shared future. The world is not a mirror. It's a mosaic. Every perspective a tile. Every voice a piece of the pattern. And the more we assume consensus, the more we miss the beauty of the full picture. Every person carries a truth that is both valid and incomplete. And if we listen closely, we may hear echoes of ourselves in even the most unfamiliar stories. You've likely felt it before, that strange disorientation when someone reacts to something in a way you never expected. You pause, confused, wondering how they could see it so differently. And in that moment, the illusion cracks. You realize you've been living in a projection, one where your worldview is center stage, and now, the lights shift. This cracking can be painful. It means letting go of certainty, of superiority, of the idea that we have it figured out. But it also creates space for dialogue, for connection, for growth. So ask yourself gently, where have I assumed others see what I see? Where have I mistaken familiarity for truth? Where have I shut the door on curiosity? And now, take a breath. Because in the next segment, we explore the shadow of that curiosity. The moment when being watched becomes more than discomfort, when the imaginary gaze of others begins to govern our actions. Segment 9. The Spotlight Effect. You're not the star of their story. You walk into a room and suddenly everything feels louder. The sound of your footsteps, the rhythm of your breath, the way your clothes sit against your body. You notice how your hands move, how your voice sounds, how your laugh feels too sharp. It's as if a spotlight has found you, and you're standing on a stage built from your own awareness. Everyone is watching, or so it feels. This is the spotlight effect. A psychological phenomenon that convinces us we are being observed, evaluated, and remembered far more than we actually are. In our minds, the world becomes a theater, and we sometimes proudly, often anxiously, become its unwilling star. But the truth is quieter. Most people are too wrapped in their own concerns, their own insecurities, their own performances to give ours more than a passing glance. Still, we feel the gaze. We narrate our lives as though someone else is always listening, watching, judging. It begins early, In adolescence, when self-awareness blooms into self-consciousness, we become aware of how we're seen, and that awareness clings like static. It doesn't leave when we grow older. It just becomes more subtle, woven into every interaction, every presentation, every moment of vulnerability. The fear of being seen becomes the fear of being misseen, misunderstood, misjudged. Psychological research shows that people consistently overestimate how much others notice their mistakes, their fashion choices, even the expressions on their faces. Participants who wore an embarrassing t-shirt into a crowded room were sure everyone noticed. In reality, almost no one did. And yet, knowing that doesn't always change the feeling. Because the spotlight effect isn't logical, it's emotional. It speaks to something older, something primal. The longing for belonging, the avoidance of shame, the hope that someone, somewhere truly sees us. We want to be noticed, but only in the best ways. We fear being seen in our worst moments, so we manage our image like fragile glass. This management becomes an invisible labor. We edit ourselves in real time. We self-monitor, self-correct, and self-contain. We become both performer and director, anticipating reactions, adjusting tone, rehearsing lines we may never say. Even solitude can feel performative, as if we imagine someone peeking in through the walls of our mind. But in truth, no one is watching us with the intensity we imagine. People are living inside their own spotlights, their own pressures, their own mirrors. Most glances are fleeting. Most judgments are soft. Most memories of our awkward moments disappear in the tide of others' concerns. Still, the spotlight effect lingers because it offers a kind of meaning. If everyone is watching, then every move matters. Our story becomes significant. We are the protagonist, the lead. But this imagined significance can become a trap, because not only does it heighten anxiety, it also creates isolation. If you're always performing, you rarely rest. If you're always being seen, you rarely see yourself. There is a strange relief in stepping out of the spotlight, in realizing that not everything is a performance, that silence doesn't demand explanation, that mistakes don't require punishment, that being human means being forgettable sometimes, and that's okay. What if we embraced that forgettability? What if we allowed ourselves to be background characters in someone else's story, just for a while? What if we let go of the pressure to impress, to charm, to win approval? What might we discover in the absence of imagined eyes? Maybe we'd rediscover authenticity, the freedom to speak without scripting, to wear what feels good, not what looks good, to laugh loudly, to cry openly, to stumble without shame. Maybe we'd come home to ourselves, not the curated self, but the quiet one, the real one, waiting in the wings. And maybe, just maybe, we'd extend that same gentleness to others. If we stop believing everyone's watching us, maybe we'd watch others more closely, not to judge, but to understand, to witness the quiet beauty of a stranger's ordinary moment, to realize everyone is carrying something unseen. Everyone is dodging their own imagined spotlight. The spotlight effect doesn't disappear entirely, but we can learn to dim it, to step into spaces without constantly scanning for eyes, to live a little softer, less burdened by an audience that isn't really there. This shift doesn't mean abandoning self-awareness. It means softening it. It means holding it gently, like a candle, not a spotlight. It means remembering that we are not always under examination, and when we are, we can still be kind to ourselves. And so, ask yourself gently, where has the spotlight made you smaller? Where has it silenced your voice? What would happen if you moved through the world with less self-monitoring, more self-trust? You are not the star of their story. Most of the time, they aren't even reading the same chapter. That's not a tragedy, it's a release. Now breathe, let the imagined gaze fade. Let yourself become small, not in worth, but in pressure. Let yourself be ordinary. Let yourself be enough. And now let's go deeper. Because sometimes, our performances don't just protect us from others, they protect us from parts of ourselves. We tell stories about who we are, who we've always been, and who we must continue to be. But what if those stories are traps? Segment 10. Confirmation bias. The lie that feels like truth. Imagine standing in a vast library. Every book on every shelf affirms what you already believe. You reach for one at random, and it agrees with you. Every page nods along, whispering, "You're right." You walk deeper into the stacks, searching for truth, but the truth only mirrors your own thoughts. You never question why. You never wonder what books are missing. This is the quiet trap of confirmation bias. It is not loud. It does not argue. It agrees with you in a voice that sounds like your own. It surrounds you with comfort, not challenge. Validation, not growth. It makes the world feel coherent, but that coherence can be dangerous. Confirmation bias is the psychological tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information in ways that affirm our existing beliefs. It protects our worldview, shields our ego, and preserves the stories we tell about ourselves and the world. But in doing so, it narrows our vision. It filters complexity through a biased lens, and what remains is not truth, but the illusion of it. The most unsettling part is how unconscious it is. You don't realize you're doing it. You click on the article that confirms your opinion. You remember the conversation that made you feel smart. You ignore the data that contradicts your position. And over time, you build a fortress of familiar thoughts, a castle of certainty, reinforced with each repeated idea. This is not just a personal habit. It is collective. Entire communities, cultures, even nations can fall into this pattern. Echo chambers are not built by accident. They are constructed from confirmation bias, brick by brick, and within them, dissent becomes rare, even dangerous. When everyone around you agrees, disagreement feels like betrayal. But why does the mind cling so tightly to what it already believes? Because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Because contradiction threatens our identity. Because change is painful. And because deep down, most of us are more afraid of being wrong than we are of staying blind. The mind, like the body, seeks stability. But sometimes that stability becomes stagnation. We stop asking questions. We stop listening. We stop growing. We don't search for truth. We search for comfort that looks like truth. Imagine walking through your daily life wearing tinted glasses. Everything appears a certain color. Over time, you forget you're wearing them. The world just looks that way. This is confirmation bias. It colors every thought, every judgment, every conclusion. And unless we pause, unless we check, we will believe the color is real. Think of how often it shows up. In relationships, we interpret a loved one's words based on our assumptions, not their intent. In politics, we dismiss opposing views without ever hearing them fully. In our self-image, we remember only the evidence that supports how we already feel about ourselves, good or bad. It's not logic, it's selective memory. It's filtered empathy, it's biased perception. And it's human. That's what makes it so powerful and so forgivable. We all do it. We all have stories we want to protect, fears we want to soothe, identities we want to preserve. But the danger lies in mistaking this protection for truth. When we confuse agreement with accuracy, we lose the ability to see clearly. So what can we do? First, we can learn to recognize it. To notice when a piece of information feels too satisfying. To pause when we're certain. To question when we feel the strongest urge to defend. Sometimes doubt is a doorway, not a threat. We can also practice curiosity, not performative curiosity, but the kind that truly wants to understand. The kind that says, "Tell me more," instead of "Let me explain." The kind that listens to be changed, not just to reply. And we can surround ourselves with voices that challenge us. Not to argue, but to expand. To add texture to our thoughts. To remind us that no single perspective holds the full truth. That wisdom is not certainty. It is openness. There's freedom in admitting we were wrong. There's growth in discovering a new view. There's beauty in contradiction. Because in those moments, we are no longer just reinforcing who we were. We are becoming something more. Some of the most transformative moments in life come not when we are proven right, but when we discover we were wrong, and we survive it. The ground shifts, the old belief breaks, and something wiser rises in its place. Let this be your invitation, not to abandon your beliefs, but to hold them more gently, to walk with them like questions, not commandments, to explore the spaces beyond your certainty. And if you're willing to pause, really pause, you might find that your most rigid convictions were never walls at all, just temporary shelters. Beliefs that once protected you may no longer serve you. Stories you clung to may now be holding you back. And in their place you might discover something richer, nuance, complexity, a truth that breathes. Because truth does not need to shout. It waits patient and quiet, beyond the walls we've built to protect our pride. And if we listen closely, without fear, we may finally hear it whisper something unfamiliar and liberating. And now let us continue, because some of the darkest tricks of the mind don't just distort what we believe, they rewrite what we remember. Segment 11. Memory Distortion. The past you recall never happened that way. Memory is a fragile thing. It feels like a photograph we can pull out at will, crisp, fixed, unchanged. But memory is not a still image. It's more like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. Each time we revisit it, something runs, something shifts, something fades, and still, we believe what we remember is true. But what if the truth is less certain than we imagine? What if the past is not preserved, but rewritten, quietly, subtly, each time we recall it? This is the paradox of memory distortion, the unsettling realization that your recollections may not be reliable, that your own mind, with its warmth and tenderness, might be your most convincing editor. Our brains do not record life like a video camera. They interpret, they prioritize emotion, they leave gaps, and when those gaps appear, the brain fills them in, not with facts, but with narratives that make sense to us. And what makes sense is often shaped by how we feel now, not what truly happened then. Studies show that even vivid memories, ones we swear by, ones that feel etched in stone, are susceptible to distortion. A word added here, a detail altered there, and over time, the memory changes, slowly, invisibly, until we are certain of something that never occurred. It can be as small as misremembering what someone wore, or as significant as being sure a conversation happened when it didn't. Entire events can be fabricated by the mind, especially when emotion is involved. Strong feelings, fear, love, shame, act as highlighters, making certain moments stand out. But they also act as filters, bending the image to fit the story we need to tell. Think of a time you argued with someone. You remember their tone, their words, their posture. You remember feeling hurt. But when they recall it, they describe it differently. Not because they're lying, but because their emotional filter rewrote the moment, just as yours did. Two people, one event, two realities. This is why memory is so often the battleground in relationships. We fight over what happened, who said what, who was right. But often we're not fighting about the event. We're fighting about the memory, or rather two versions of it. And because we trust our memories, we assume the other must be wrong. But the truth is slipperier. Memory is not a courtroom transcript. It's a story we keep editing. This matters deeply, because the stories we tell about the past shape who we are in the present. We base our identities on recollection. We say, I'm like this because that happened. But what if what we believe happened never truly occurred? What if we are building the self on sand? Yet this isn't a cause for despair. It's an invitation to humility, to curiosity, to compassion, for ourselves and others. We are all doing the best we can with imperfect recall. Knowing this, we can hold memory more gently. We can question the stories we tell, not to discard them, but to open space within them. We can ask, what might I have missed? What might they have felt? What if there's more to the past than my version allows? Memory distortion also shows up in how we speak to ourselves. Sometimes we remember ourselves as more foolish than we were. We rewrite the past to justify our self-criticism. Other times, We remember only the moments that support our fear. We become trapped in a loop of false evidence. The mind becomes both the jailer and the jury. But there is power in reframing, in rewriting memory with intention, not delusion, in looking back and asking not just what happened, but how we held it, how we shaped it, how we survived it. Our memories are stories, and stories can evolve. So take a moment now. Think of a memory that defines you, one you return to often, one that feels heavy or bright. Ask yourself, how do I know it's accurate? What parts might be colored by fear, by pride, by longing? And what would it mean to let go of the need for total accuracy? Maybe the purpose of memory is not precision, but meaning. Maybe it exists not to prove what happened, but to guide who we become. And if that's true, then we can be more than what we remember. We can step outside the story. We can write new ones. Because sometimes the past doesn't just change in memory, it reaches forward and shapes the future. And sometimes we must let go of how we remember in order to become someone new. Perhaps our minds bend the past not to deceive us, but to heal us. Perhaps forgetting is sometimes mercy. Perhaps distortion is how the soul makes sense of grief. Now breathe. You are not the sum of your memories. You are the space between them. You are the silence beneath the story. And from that silence, anything can emerge. Next, we'll look at the way our minds rush to fill that silence, not with clarity, but with patterns. Segment 12. Apophenia. Seeing meaning where there is none. You lie awake at night and see a face in the shadows on the ceiling, a pattern in the static, a message in the meaningless. Your mind reaches out and finds something, not because it's there, but because it must make sense of what is not. This is apophenia, the brain's tendency to perceive patterns, meaning, and connections in randomness. It is one of the mind's most poetic and deceptive habits. It makes the world feel alive, intentional, shaped. It transforms coincidence into fate, randomness into story, noise into signal. And it does all of this quietly, invisibly, often without our awareness. The human brain is a meaning-making machine. It is built not just to observe, but to interpret. We don't just see the stars, we draw constellations between them. We don't just hear sounds, we hear language, rhythm, tone. We don't just live through events, we weave them into narratives. We are storytellers by nature, and sometimes the story comes first. The facts follow later. Apophenia arises from this deep-rooted impulse. A rustle in the bushes becomes a predator. A coincidence becomes a sign. A gut feeling becomes a premonition. And while this may seem irrational, it once served us well. In the wild, it was safer to assume the sound meant danger than to risk ignoring it. Better to see a pattern where none exists than to miss the one that does. But in the modern world, where our threats are more abstract, this instinct can lead us astray. We see symbols in the clouds and signs in strangers. We interpret glitches in technology as messages. We imagine intentions where there are none. And most seductively, we create narratives that confirm our inner fears and hopes, even when the evidence is thin. Think of how easily we find faces in objects. The human brain is wired to detect them, a phenomenon called pareidolia. A power outlet becomes a surprised expression. A tree's bark holds a weeping figure. The shadows on a wall form the silhouette of something watching. This isn't madness, it's perception, reaching beyond what is present. But apophenia goes deeper than visual illusions. It shapes belief, it fuels superstition, it anchors conspiracy. When we feel out of control, uncertain, vulnerable, apophenia steps in. It offers a story, even if that story is terrifying. It is better, we think, to believe that someone is behind the chaos than to believe no one is. Even a malevolent order is more comforting than complete disorder. This is why conspiracy theories thrive in times of fear. They offer meaning, they connect dots, they create an enemy, a cause, a reason, and even when they are disproven, the emotional logic they follow is hard to shake. Because apophenia is not about truth, it's about the hunger for meaning. But not all pattern seeking is harmful. It is also the root of creativity, of insight, of metaphor. A poet sees the moon and writes of longing. A painter finds emotion in geometry. A composer hears stories in sound. In this sense, Apophenia is sacred. It allows us to connect, to express, to wonder. The danger lies in confusing emotional resonance with factual reality. Just because something feels true does not make it so. Just because a coincidence moves us does not mean it was meant to be. Just because a pattern appears does not mean it holds power. The mind sees meaning, but the soul must ask, is it real? There is beauty in seeing connections, but there is also peace in letting randomness be random, in allowing the universe its silence, in resisting the urge to assign everything a reason. So what do we do when we find ourselves making meaning from chaos? We pause. We breathe. We ask, gently, what need the story is meeting? Is it comfort, control, a sense of belonging? Often the pattern reflects our longing, not the world. And that longing is not wrong. It is deeply human. It is the same longing that built myths, painted ceilings with gods, gave names to stars. It is what makes us reach for more, not just information, but understanding. But understanding does not always come from connecting the dots. Sometimes it comes from sitting in the space between them. We can still enjoy the constellations even if we know the stars are scattered. We can still feel the awe of a coincidence without needing it to be destiny. And we can still tell stories, rich, symbolic, meaningful stories, without surrendering to every whisper of connection as absolute truth. Sometimes what we see is simply the mind reaching for light in the dark. It is the ancient impulse to bring order to the unknown. It is the yearning for coherence in the face of entropy. It is not weakness, it is the creative brilliance of being human. But even creativity needs grounding. Even wonder needs boundaries. To live with apophenia is to dance with illusion. But awareness allows us to choose the rhythm, to enjoy the beauty of patterns without being ruled by them, to honor our imagination without mistaking it for prophecy. So hold your patterns gently. Let them inspire, not define. Let them lead you toward insight, but not imprison you in certainty. The more we learn to sit with ambiguity, the less desperate we become for premature answers. It takes courage to look at the chaos and say, this might mean nothing. It takes strength to resist turning every pain into a prophecy. But in doing so, we reclaim something sacred, the freedom to simply be. Now take a breath. The stars do not know your name, but you may still find poetry in their silence. And perhaps that is enough, perhaps it always was. To wonder without needing proof, to imagine without clinging, to live among unanswered questions with grace. There's something else to consider here, something that makes apophenia even more intimate. The stories we create don't just emerge from fear or curiosity. Sometimes they're born from love, from longing, from the aching desire to stay connected to someone or something we've lost. A song plays, and we hear their voice. A breeze moves through a window, and we take it as a sign. These are not errors of judgment. They are gestures of the heart. Apophenia, in these moments, becomes a bridge between what is and what was, a way to continue the conversation with what we cannot hold anymore. And yet, even in that beauty, we must tread with care, because sometimes the meanings we construct begin to demand obedience. We stop being open to reality and start bending ourselves to fit a narrative. We become trapped in the very stories we created to free us. That's when apophenia becomes not just poetic, but perilous. The line between wisdom and delusion is often thin, and crossing it doesn't always look dramatic. It can happen slowly, silently, a quiet shift in how we see the world, a narrowing of perspective, a soft refusal to accept randomness, even when randomness is the most honest thing we can face. To live meaningfully, we do not have to force meaning into every corner. We can let some things remain unanswered. We can meet mystery without rushing to explain it. And in doing so, we give ourselves the rare gift of stillness, the ability to simply be with what is. Apophenia will always be part of us. It is written into the architecture of the mind, but we are not helpless before it. We can be aware of the patterns we project. We can listen without always translating. We can observe without always interpreting. And in this space of awareness, we become more than just pattern makers. We become witnesses, dreamers who can also discern, creators who can also let go. So the next time you see a sign where there may be none, ask yourself not only if it's real, but also what you need it to mean. Then ask if you can hold that meaning gently, knowing it may dissolve with the morning light. Because sometimes the most profound wisdom is not in the story, but in the silence between stories. Next, we move into a darker chamber of the mind, not about the meanings we invent, but the emotions we suppress. Because sometimes what we push down does not disappear. It waits, and it returns in disguise. Segment 13. Repression. The ghosts beneath your thoughts. There are things inside you that you don't remember choosing to forget. Echoes too soft to hear, shadows that fall across your thoughts without form or name. These are the ghosts of your mind, the buried emotions, the hidden pain, the unspoken truths. And though they live beneath the surface, they shape your waking life more than you know. Repression is the silent sculptor of the self. It is not denial in its loud form. It is the quiet pact your mind makes with itself to survive. It says, "You don't need this right now. Let me take it from you." And so the memory is folded, the feeling shelved, the fear sedated. You move on, or so you think, but the repressed never dies. It waits, it reshapes, it returns in disguise, as anxiety, as chronic tension, as inexplicable sadness or anger. It might show up in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in the way you flinch at certain sounds or faces. The ghosts of your mind do not rest. They rearrange the furniture of your inner world until you no longer recognize the layout. You might forget the moment you were betrayed, but you can't explain why you never trust. You might not remember the scream, but your body still tightens at loud voices. Trauma can go underground, but it leaves behind roots, roots that grow up through the cracks into the day. Freud called repression the cornerstone of the unconscious, a defense mechanism that hides what we're not ready to feel. And it's not always wrong to do so. Repression protects us from pain that would be overwhelming. It helps children survive what they cannot understand. It lets us function when falling apart isn't an option. But repression doesn't erase. It stores, and everything stored must eventually be sorted. The hardest part is that we often don't know what we've repressed. The mind is too skilled, too elegant in its concealment. So we walk through life with a feeling we can't name, reacting to ghosts we don't remember inviting. And we call this normal. But there are signs, subtle, soft, a recurring dream, a phobia with no origin, a pattern in relationships that leaves you always alone or always abandoned. These are the clues, the echoes, and to follow them requires gentleness, not force. Repression cannot be broken open. It must be unwrapped, slowly, with care. This is not easy work. To unearth what we have buried is to feel it again. And sometimes for the first time, but it is also the work of freedom. Because what we repress controls us, and what we remember, we can begin to understand. And what we understand, we can choose to release. The danger of repressed emotion is not just internal. It seeps into how we treat others. It becomes the coldness in our tone, the impatience in our silence, the distance in our eyes. Hurt, when hidden, becomes sharp, and it cuts in places we never intended. Sometimes we confuse repression with strength. We admire those who move on quickly, who don't let it get to them. But healing is not the same as hiding, and feeling deeply is not a weakness. It is a sign that the soul is awake. So what would it mean to meet the ghosts, to turn toward what scares us instead of away? It might mean crying for something you don't fully remember. It might mean grieving a version of yourself you lost long ago. It might mean forgiving someone who never asked, or forgiving yourself. The process is rarely linear. Memories do not return in full. Sometimes they arrive as sensations, as images, as sudden waves of emotion with no name. But even in their vagueness, they are real. They are yours, and they deserve your attention. To begin, you do not need to dig. You only need to listen to your body, to your patterns, to your dreams, and to ask gently, what have I not yet faced? The question alone is a light. Repression thrives in darkness, in silence, in shame. But it begins to dissolve the moment it is held, even lightly, in awareness. The ghosts want your attention, not your fear. And sometimes when we finally meet them, we realize they were never trying to haunt us. They were trying to tell us what was true. You can let the ghost speak. You can listen, and still be safe. You can feel, and still be whole. And there is healing not only in the remembering, but in the reweaving. When we give voice to what was buried, we begin to reshape the story of ourselves. We are no longer merely the sum of things done to us, or withheld from us. We become authors again. And from the fragments, we compose something new, not to erase what happened, but to integrate it. The story expands, it deepens, it softens. In that expansion, we may even find space for compassion, not just for ourselves, but for others. We begin to understand how many people are walking around, haunted by what they've never been allowed to name. We see how pain turns to silence, and silence to separation. And suddenly, we are less alone. Suddenly, our story is not strange. It is shared. There is strength in softness. And there is bravery in feeling. To reclaim what was lost is not to dwell in suffering, but to recognize the full texture of your humanity. Repression tries to flatten us, but healing, slow, imperfect healing, brings back the depth, the color, the contrast. And so little by little the ghosts become guides. They are no longer specters to be feared, but messengers bearing the truth of who we were, who we are, and who we might still become. And if you let them speak long enough, you may find that your presence softens too, that you begin to react less out of defense and more out of clarity, that your relationships stop echoing your wounds and start reflecting your growth. Because when you reclaim the repressed, you reclaim your response. You shift from surviving to choosing. This isn't the end of the work. The mind will always seek comfort in forgetting. The heart will always want to protect itself. But the more you meet your ghosts, the less power they have. And one day they may no longer feel like ghosts at all, but parts of you are finally ready to welcome home. Next, we descend even deeper, into the mechanisms of self-deception, into the ways we justify what we know isn't right, into the subtle lies we tell ourselves just to sleep at night. Segment 14. Moral disengagement. The stories that make it okay. There's a particular silence that comes just after we do something we know is wrong. It's not the silence of peace or rest. It's a stillness that hums like guilt behind the eyes. But we often don't feel it for long. Our minds are quick to comfort us, quick to rewrite the story, and before long, we're convinced we were justified, that we had no choice, that we were right, or at least not wrong. This is the machinery of moral disengagement, the process by which we make the unacceptable feel acceptable. It is the quiet trick of the mind that allows ordinary people to do harmful things without feeling like bad people. It's not a failure of ethics, it's a feature of the human psyche, evolved to protect our identity, even at the expense of truth. It starts subtly. We rename the action. I didn't lie. I just didn't tell everything. It wasn't cruelty. It was discipline. It wasn't betrayal. It was necessity. Language becomes a veil, softening the edges of responsibility. We shift the blame to circumstances, to others, to fate. We reduce the victim to a stereotype. We tell ourselves they deserved it, or that they weren't really harmed. And with each rationalization, the original sting fades. Albert Bandura, the psychologist who coined the term, explained how people distance themselves from the ethical consequences of their actions through cognitive restructuring. By reinterpreting the meaning of our behavior, we disengage our moral standards. We no longer see ourselves as part of the harm, just bystanders swept along by a larger force. Moral disengagement doesn't always lead to violence. It's in the small acts too. The comment we brush off as a joke, the injustice we ignore, because it's not our problem. The selfish impulse we justify with everyone would do the same. These moments accumulate, and over time, they shape not just what we do, but who we become. And the danger is not just what we do to others, it's what we do to ourselves. Every time we suppress discomfort instead of facing it, we chip away at our integrity. We drift further from the version of ourselves we believe in. And yet the illusion of innocence remains. What makes moral disengagement so powerful is that it doesn't feel like deceit. It feels like clarity. It feels like relief. That's why we cling to it, because it silences the conscience before the conscience can speak. But the silence is never total. It lingers beneath the surface, in the tension in our chest, the restlessness in our thoughts, the dreams we'd rather forget. The mind can rewrite the story, but the body remembers. To confront moral disengagement is to face discomfort. It is to admit that we are not always who we want to be, that good people can do harm, that we too are capable of closing our eyes when the truth is too painful to see. But this confrontation is also the beginning of growth, because once we become aware of the stories we tell, we can begin to question them. We can ask, what did I avoid? Whose pain did I dismiss? What would it mean to take responsibility? Not to punish myself, but to repair. These questions are not easy, but they are necessary. Moral disengagement is a shield, but it is also a prison. It keeps us from feeling guilt, but it also keeps us from feeling empathy. It protects the ego, but isolates the heart. And over time, it creates a dissonance we can no longer ignore. Healing begins with truth. Not absolute truth, but emotional truth. The truth of how we felt, what we feared, what we wanted to avoid. And from that place, we can start to reconnect, not just with others, but with ourselves. To live with integrity is not to be perfect. It is to remain awake, to notice when we start to drift, to hold ourselves with compassion and accountability, and to remember that morality is not a destination, it is a practice. And perhaps the most hopeful part is this: we can change the stories. We can revise the scripts. We can look back and say, I was wrong, and not shatter. We can choose to step into discomfort, not because it feels good, but because it leads somewhere honest. Because integrity is not born in the absence of error, but in the willingness to face it. The moment we stop running from ourselves is the moment we begin returning to who we are beneath all the roles and narratives. We become real again, grounded, present, and in that presence, something unexpected happens. We grow gentler, less judgmental of others, more willing to admit when we don't know, more capable of forgiving when we've been hurt, because we've seen how easy it is to lose sight of what's right and how painful the path back can be. Moral disengagement dulls the soul, but honesty sharpens it again. Slowly, courageously, quietly, and in that quiet clarity, the world opens again. Not as a battlefield of right and wrong, but as a place of complexity, responsibility, and continual return. So take a breath. Notice where you've rewritten the past, where you've softened the story. Ask yourself, not with shame, but with curiosity, why you needed to. And then if you're ready, write something new. Next we turn inward again, to the war between what we want and what we show, the conflict between desire and image. Because sometimes the deepest deception is the mask we wear every day. Segment 15. The false self. When the performance becomes the person, there's a quiet mask we wear, not for deception but for survival. It's not painted or visible, but it sits just beneath the skin, forming with each expectation met, each desire denied, each subtle cue from the world about who we should be. Over time, it grows familiar. It smiles when needed. It speaks when silence feels risky. It performs until the performance feels like the only truth left. This is the false self, a version of you that fits the room, pleases the crowd, avoids disapproval. It's not born from malice, but from a longing to belong. From a fear of rejection so deep it carves identity into something presentable. And with each layer added to protect, something inside is hidden away. Children build their false selves early, not because they want to lie, but because they learn quickly what earns love and what earns silence. A parent smiles more when you're quiet. A teacher praises compliance, not curiosity. The message becomes clear: to be safe, be agreeable, to be accepted, be who they want you to be. As we grow, the pattern repeats. We curate our words, our gestures, even our dreams. The real self, wild, tender, unfiltered, waits patiently in the wings, unsure if there's still room for it on stage. And sometimes we forget it exists entirely. This false self can succeed in the world. It often does. It's the one who gets hired, applauded, admired, but inside there's a strange hollowness, a dissonance between what is shown and what is felt. A subtle ache that whispers, "This isn't quite me." And the ache grows heavier with time, because maintaining the false self takes energy, constant calibration, constant vigilance. You become an expert in emotional weather, always adjusting to avoid storms. But in doing so, you lose the grounding of your own sky. It's not that the false self is always a lie. Sometimes it's a part of us. But when it becomes the whole of us, when it takes the lead in every conversation, every choice, the true self withers in its absence. Psychologist Donald Winnicott described this as the split between the true and false self. He believed the false self emerges as a defense, a necessary shield in an unresponsive or overwhelming environment. But the tragedy is when that shield becomes identity. When we believe the mask is our face, and what happens to the true self? It doesn't vanish, it retreats. It hides in art, in dreams, in sudden tears that arrive without warning. It speaks through discomfort, through restlessness, through the feeling of being unknown even by those closest to you. It waits and hopes to be invited back. But inviting it back isn't easy. It means disappointing people. It means uncertainty. It means risking the very thing the false self was built to prevent: rejection. And yet the cost of not risking it is greater. Because without the true self, we may be liked, but never truly loved. To begin reclaiming the true self, we must start small. Notice the moments we say yes when we mean no. The times we laugh to avoid silence. The ways we shrink to fit a space. Each moment is a clue, a breadcrumb leading back to something real. We may find we've built a life around the false self. Careers, relationships, routines, all structured by a persona, and this can feel overwhelming. But it doesn't mean we've failed. It means we've survived. The false self isn't evil. It protected us. But now we ask, is it still serving us? The answer unfolds gently, not in one grand act of authenticity, but in daily returns, speaking honestly when it trembles, holding silence when the urge to perform is strong, choosing presence over perfection, and over time the layers loosen. The mask softens, the real self steps forward, tentative but whole. It may not be polished, it may not please everyone, but it will feel like home. There is courage in becoming real again, in saying this is me, even when it's messy. There is peace in letting go of the constant performance, in trusting that who we are, unmasked, unfiltered, is enough. And in that trust, we reconnect not just with ourselves but with others. Because true intimacy begins where performance ends. When we show up as we are, we make space for others to do the same. Vulnerability becomes a bridge, not a burden, so breathe. You are not a role, you are not a performance. You are not the mask you wear to be loved. You are the being beneath it, tender, changing, real. And when you live from that place, the place beneath the mask, You begin to rediscover the small joys that only your true self can feel. A laugh that isn't rehearsed, a pause that isn't filled, a moment of connection that asks for nothing in return. These are not grand revelations, but they are quiet revolutions. Each one a step home. Living without the mask doesn't mean you lose structure or self-control. It means the structure begins to match your soul. It means saying yes becomes honest, and saying no no longer feels like failure. It means you are finally not performing your life. You are inhabiting it. And maybe, just maybe, someone will meet you there, the real you, and they won't flinch. They'll stay, and you'll realize that the love you were trying to earn through performance is nothing compared to the love that finds you when you are fully seen. Next, we'll explore the hidden costs of that performance. Not just who it hides, but what it demands. Because sometimes the need to be seen turns into a hunger that can never be satisfied. Segment 16. The validation trap. When attention replaces connection, we live in a world that rewards appearance over essence, visibility over truth. In that world, attention feels like love, applause feels like belonging, and we learn to seek the spotlight, believing it will warm us like the sun. But what happens when attention becomes a substitute for connection? When being seen replaces being known? At first, validation feels like nourishment, a compliment, a like, a glance of approval. These things are small, but they shimmer. They tell us we're doing something right, that we matter. But they are also fleeting. Like sugar, they spike and crash, and the more we rely on them, the more we need them. The validation trap is not about vanity. It's about vulnerability. It begins when we learn that love can be earned through performance, when the applause becomes louder than our own heartbeat. We start tailoring ourselves to what draws attention, the laugh that always lands, the pose that always pleases. And in doing so, we slowly displace our center. We stop asking, "Is this me?" and start asking, "Will they like it?" Over time, the pursuit of validation becomes compulsive. We refresh the page, we reread the message, we replay the moment in our minds. Each external nod is a thread in a safety net that feels necessary, because without it, we fear we will fall into obscurity, into rejection, into invisibility. But here's the tragedy. The more we chase validation, the less connected we become, because true connection requires authenticity, and authenticity often risks disapproval. To be truly known is to be seen in our complexity, not just the curated highlights. When we rely on validation, we begin to shape our identities around expectation and the parts of ourselves that don't get applause. We silence them, hide them, edit them out of the frame. We become brands instead of beings. And the more polished the image, the more distant we feel from our inner life. This hunger for attention often masks a deeper hunger, the desire to be accepted without needing to perform. To be embraced, not for what we show, but for what we carry. The messy, the mundane, the honest. But that kind of love requires presence, not just presence online. It asks for listening, for slowness, for intimacy. There's nothing wrong with enjoying praise. We're wired to respond to positive feedback. But when our sense of self becomes tethered to it, we lose resilience. A critical comment can feel like collapse. Silence can feel like erasure. We become reactive, addicted not to joy, but to approval. And the saddest part, validation rarely satisfies. It soothes, but only temporarily. Like drinking salt water, it makes us thirstier the more we consume. Because what we truly seek is connection, and connection isn't loud, it's quiet. It lives in the in-between, in eye contact, in shared silence, in being with, not performing for. Breaking free from the validation trap begins with awareness, with asking, what am I trying to prove? Who am I trying to impress? And what would I do if no one were watching? These questions are not accusations. They are invitations to return to the self beneath the spotlight. We can learn to give ourselves what we keep seeking from others: affirmation, acceptance, presence, We can notice the impulse to perform and choose honesty instead. We can practice being enough, even when no one applauds. This doesn't mean withdrawing. It means reorienting, showing up in the world from the inside out, not the outside in. Letting validation be a gift, not a drug, and in doing so, we rediscover the quiet miracle of being seen, not for what we do, but for who we are. So take a moment now. Let the silence settle. Ask yourself, when was the last time I felt truly known, not admired, not followed, but understood? That is the heart of connection. That is what we long for, and in that longing, there is hope, because the path back to connection is not glamorous, but it is real, and it is always open. When we remember that we are more than the mirror others hold up, something shifts. We no longer scramble for attention, but begin to cultivate presence. We no longer chase applause, but welcome silence. We learn to be with ourselves in the absence of affirmation, and in that space we begin to hear something deeper, the sound of our own inner life. And that inner life, when honored, begins to nourish us in ways attention never could. It offers steadiness, integrity, a relationship with the self that does not require performance. And slowly we become less hungry for the outside to echo what we already know inside. Real connection does not shout. It listens. It does not demand proof. It allows presence. And it does not fade when the spotlight turns elsewhere. Because it was never built on performance. It was built on truth. And maybe, just maybe, the silence we once feared becomes something else entirely. Not emptiness, but space. Room to grow. Room to remember. Room to return to what matters most. In that room, the self slowly expands, not through the eyes of others, but through the quiet act of being present, of feeling our own breath, of letting stillness speak louder than applause. And we begin to offer others that same gift, presence without condition, listening without judgment, love without performance. Perhaps then, attention finds its rightful place, not as the core of our worth, but as a passing visitor. Welcome, but not needed. Seen but not worshipped, and in that quiet shift, something inside us softens. The hunger settles, the noise recedes, and for the first time in a long time, we feel whole. Because maybe we never needed to be seen by everyone. Maybe we only ever needed to be seen truly, even if only by one. And maybe that one could be ourselves. Next, we explore what happens when connection becomes control, when love turns conditional, when attention is no longer given freely, but demanded, manipulated, and withheld. Segment 17. Emotional blackmail. When love becomes leverage, it begins softly, not with shouting or sharpness, but with subtle shifts in tone, a sigh that lasts a second too long, a silence that feels like punishment, a glance that says more than any words ever could. You feel it before you understand it, a quiet pressure pressing in, something unspoken curling beneath the surface of your most trusted relationships. This is emotional blackmail, the art of leveraging love, closeness, or attachment to get what one wants. It's not always conscious. It doesn't always come from cruelty. Often it comes from fear. But fear, when not acknowledged, has a way of twisting love into something darker. Something that feels like care on the surface, but underneath demands your submission. In its simplest form, emotional blackmail sounds like, if you really loved me, you would. But more often, it doesn't sound like anything at all. It's in the withdrawal of affection after a disagreement. In the long silences after you say no. In the guilt you feel not because you've done something wrong, but because someone else is subtly making you responsible for their pain. The hallmark of emotional blackmail is conditional love. It's love that arrives with a price tag, a silent contract you never agreed to sign. A parent reminds you of all their sacrifices when you express a boundary. A partner withholds affection when you choose differently. A friend frames your autonomy as betrayal. They don't have to raise their voice. The message is clear: comply, or I will make you feel the weight of my disappointment. And you do feel it, because you care, because you want to preserve the bond, because the thought of losing connection, even unhealthy connection, is terrifying. Over time, emotional blackmail reshapes how you show up in the relationship. You begin to second-guess your needs. You anticipate the other person's emotions before your own. You learn to avoid certain topics, behaviors, desires. Not because you've changed, but because their discomfort has become your responsibility. What makes it so hard to recognize is how close it stands to love. It masquerades as loyalty, as commitment, as emotional investment. I'm only upset because I care so much, they say. Don't you understand how much this means to me? You do. And that's why you stay silent. But silence is not safety. Silence is surrender. And when love demands your silence, it becomes something else entirely. Emotional blackmail thrives in relationships where roles are blurred, where one person takes on the role of caretaker, pleaser, fixer, where the fear of conflict is greater than the desire for truth, where harmony is maintained not through openness, but through obedience. To name it is to begin waking up. To say, "This doesn't feel right," is to reclaim your inner compass, the one that was quietly overridden every time you gave in to preserve the peace. It's not about blaming, it's about seeing. Seeing how fear becomes a weapon, seeing how guilt is used to keep you small, seeing how love is transformed into currency, something to be earned, not freely given. When you begin to untangle yourself, the backlash may come. Emotional blackmail does not like being exposed. The person who once adored you may call you cold. The one who praised your loyalty may now call you selfish. You'll be told you've changed. And maybe you have. You've begun to remember that love is not meant to be a trap. True love does not require your compliance. It does not crumble under your boundaries. It does not withhold itself to manipulate your choices. Real love listens when you say no. Real love stays, even when you disagree. Real love does not vanish when you find your voice. Healing from emotional blackmail begins not with confrontation but with clarity. You don't need to explain yourself to someone who refuses to hear you. You don't need to argue your worth. You only need to decide, what kind of love do I believe in? What kind of love am I willing to fight for? And perhaps the hardest question, have I ever used emotional blackmail myself? Because we all in moments of fear or insecurity have leaned into control. We have all longed to be chosen so desperately that we forgot to offer others the freedom to choose. To heal is not only to protect ourselves from manipulation, it is to release others from our need to control them. It is to make peace with uncertainty, to trust that love, when real, does not need to be forced. So take a breath. Feel the spaces where you once bent to stay loved. Feel the cost of that bending. And know this: love that cost your selfhood is too expensive. The most radical act of love is letting others be free, and insisting on the same for yourself. And now we move into another kind of danger. Not the kind that wounds openly, but the kind that seduces, that smothers you in affection and intensity, until you forget where you end and they begin. Segment 18. Love bombing. When intensity is a mask, it begins with light, dazzling, warm, irresistible, a sudden spotlight that turns in your direction, bathing you in attention, affection, admiration. You feel seen, chosen, perhaps even saved. The gestures are grand, the words intoxicating. I've never felt this way about anyone before. You're perfect. Where have you been all my life? It doesn't feel like manipulation at first. It feels like magic, like the movies promised. You are drawn in, and why wouldn't you be? In a world that so often feels cold and indifferent, love bombing feels like fire, like home. But fire consumes as quickly as it comforts, and the warmth, you soon realize, comes at a cost. Because when love is given too fast, too soon, too intensely, it often hides something else. A hunger not for connection, but for control. Love bombing is a psychological tactic used to overwhelm someone with affection and adoration in order to influence or manipulate. It is most often used by individuals who fear abandonment, crave dominance, or lack the emotional maturity for real intimacy. The initial affection is not necessarily false, but it is transactional, conditional, weaponized. The pattern is deceptively beautiful. At first, you are flooded with messages, compliments, gestures, promises. There is an urgency to it, as if time itself is collapsing around this new bond. You are encouraged to move quickly, to trust implicitly, to merge lives before you've even had time to breathe. And beneath the intensity lies a quiet message. You are special, but only if you stay close, only if you respond, only if you give back exactly what I give you. At first you respond. Of course you do. We are wired for attachment, for connection. To be loved this fully is a kind of emotional high, but slowly, a shift begins to occur. What once felt like love starts to feel like pressure. You begin to notice that when you assert a boundary, the warmth dims, that when you ask for space, you are met with confusion, or worse, hurt. The person who once adored you now questions your loyalty. You begin to walk carefully, to censor yourself, to prioritize their feelings over your own. You feel flattered, then guilty, empowered, then ashamed. Because love bombing does not seek mutuality, it seeks possession. The tragedy is that many who fall into this pattern have been starved for love. They mistake intensity for intimacy, consistency for commitment, but real love doesn't burn like wildfire. It doesn't consume your identity. It doesn't collapse timelines in an effort to make you stay. Healthy love unfolds. It allows space for uncertainty. It honors pacing. It grows roots, not just branches, and it doesn't disappear the moment you assert independence. To recognize love bombing is to begin waking up to the ways in which affection can be used as camouflage. It is to question why things feel too good to be true. It is to listen to the whisper that says, slow down. This isn't to say that genuine connection can't be fast or passionate. But when love is wielded like a tool, when it is used to flood your defenses, override your boundaries, and pull you into dependence, it ceases to be love. It becomes strategy. And often when the bombing ends, something darker takes its place. Criticism, withdrawal, control. The very adoration that brought you in is now used to measure your worth. You used to make me feel so special. You've changed. Why can't we go back to how it was? You find yourself chasing the version of them who once lit up the room. But that version was never sustainable. It was never meant to be. It was bait. Not because they are evil, but because they do not know how to connect without performing. To extricate yourself from love bombing requires courage, because the withdrawal is painful. You miss the highs, the affection, the illusion. But illusion cannot nurture you. Only truth can. And truth says, you deserve love that doesn't rush, that doesn't push, that doesn't depend on how well you obey. You deserve love that sees you, not just in your joy, but in your silence. Not just in your reflection of them, but in your full complex self. Begin by asking, what parts of me have I hidden to maintain this intensity? What parts of them have I ignored because I wanted to believe the dream? These questions won't shatter you. They will save you. And in the aftermath, in the quiet that follows, there is space to rebuild. Slowly, gently, with honesty. Not all who love bomb do so consciously. Many are reenacting their own unresolved attachments. But understanding the wound behind the behavior does not mean you must accept the harm. Compassion is not a contract. Empathy does not require endurance. So breathe, release the need to return to something that never truly existed. Let yourself grieve the fantasy. Then step forward into something slower, steadier, safer. Because love, real love, is not a hurricane. It is the slow, steady rain that nourishes the soil beneath your feet. It allows you to grow, to rest, to be. And if you've ever felt addicted to the highs of intense affection, know this: it is not your fault. You were wired to seek warmth, but now you are learning to seek light. Let this be your turning point. Let the silence that follows love bombing be an invitation, not into loneliness, but into truth. Let it be the moment you ask yourself, what kind of love do I truly want? And more importantly, what kind of love do I truly need? Because the kind of love that sustains, the kind that holds steady even in silence, is not built on the rush. It is built on respect, on patience, on mutual presence. And when you meet that love, you will know. It won't knock you over. It will stand beside you. It will not scream your name. It will whisper, I'm here. I see you. And I'm not going anywhere. Next, we dive into another deeply unsettling reality. When affection becomes routine, and the person beside you seems present but is no longer emotionally alive. Segment 19. Emotional numbness. When intimacy becomes emptiness, there is a kind of silence that doesn't soothe, a stillness that doesn't calm. You can be lying next to someone, your bodies just inches apart, and still feel 1,000 miles away. The room is not empty, but something essential is missing. A spark, a presence, an aliveness. This is emotional numbness, not the absence of love, but the absence of connection. A ghost of intimacy, haunting the space where something living once breathed. It doesn't arrive suddenly. It creeps in over time, often unnoticed or mistaken for comfort. The conversations grow shorter, the laughter softens, the eyes look but no longer see. You share space, routines, responsibilities, but not feeling, not vulnerability, not the kind of presence that makes you feel like you truly exist in someone's world. Emotional numbness is the quiet erosion of intimacy. It's not dramatic. It doesn't shout. It's the slow fading of color from what was once vivid, the shift from connection to cohabitation. And the tragedy is, most people don't even realize it's happening until it has already settled in like fog. A heavy, invisible fog that mutes everything you try to say or feel. There are many reasons it takes root. Sometimes it's unspoken resentment, old wounds left to fester, never addressed. Sometimes it's stress, trauma, or burnout, emotional fatigue so heavy it blocks access to the heart. Other times it's protection, a learned defense against the risk of closeness, because to feel deeply is also to hurt deeply. And if you've been hurt enough, numbness can feel like safety. But numbness is not safety. It is absence, and when it becomes the dominant tone of a relationship, even the most loving gestures start to feel mechanical. A kiss is just a kiss. A touch doesn't reach the soul. Words like I love you echo, without resonance. Not because the love isn't there, but because the pathways to express it have gone cold. What makes emotional numbness so painful is that it often exists within relationships that were once full of life. You remember the early days, the electricity, the laughter, the ease, and now you wonder where it went. Or worse, if it was ever real. But it was real. What you're mourning is not illusion. It is loss. A quiet, ongoing loss that no one talks about, because on the surface everything looks fine. You still do the things, share meals, watch movies, sleep in the same bed, but underneath, a hollow space expands. You miss them, and they're right there. You ache for connection, but feel guilty for needing more. We're just tired, you tell yourself. It's just a phase, but the phase stretches. The ache deepens. To be emotionally numb is not to feel nothing. It's to feel too much and nothing, all at once. A confusion of the senses, a tension between what you remember feeling and what you're capable of feeling now. And in that dissonance, loneliness grows. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the kind you feel when your soul is untouched by the person you love. Sometimes we numb ourselves without realizing it. We focus on tasks. We stay busy. We scroll. We intellectualize. We cope in ways that keep us above the waterline, never diving beneath. And in doing so, we drift further from the emotional depths where connection truly lives. But here's the hard truth. Intimacy cannot survive on proximity alone. You cannot substitute presence for passion, habit for heart. Being physically close to someone while emotionally distant is like standing in the sun and still feeling cold. And yet numbness isn't permanent. It is a state, not a sentence. It is a sign, not of failure, but of need. The need to feel again, to risk again, to reach out, even when your hand trembles. To begin thawing emotional numbness, we must first name it. Not blame it, not fix it immediately, but recognize its presence. We must ask, what have I stopped feeling? When did I begin to pull back? What am I afraid will happen if I fully show up again? These are not comfortable questions. They stir old wounds. They challenge the protective walls we've built. But they are the doorway back, because behind numbness is always pain. And behind pain, there is longing. And behind longing, there is love. And love, real love, is worth the risk of feeling. Sometimes the way back begins with a whisper, a small confession. I miss us. I feel distant. I want to feel close to you again, but I don't know how. Vulnerability reopens the door. It doesn't guarantee the other will walk through it, but it makes it possible. And if the numbness cannot be repaired, if the silence remains unbroken, then it becomes a teacher. A guide pointing toward what you deserve, toward relationships where feeling is welcome, where connection is not lost to comfort, where love is alive, not just alive looking. Take a breath. Place your hand on your chest. Feel the beating beneath. That is your reminder. You are still here, still capable of feeling, of choosing, of changing. Next, we explore what happens when the need for emotion becomes so overwhelming that the self fractures, a dissociation not from others, but from within. When a part of you watches life pass like a movie. When detachment becomes identity. Segment 20. Depersonalization. When you feel like a stranger to yourself, there is a moment, quiet, sudden, when you look in the mirror and the reflection doesn't feel like you. The face is familiar, the features unchanged, but the connection is gone. You see the skin, the eyes, the mouth forming a practiced expression, and yet there's a strange dissonance, as though you are watching yourself from behind glass. Present, but not fully alive. Real, but not fully here. This is the essence of depersonalization, a haunting psychological state where the self becomes a distant figure. It can strike without warning. During stress, after trauma, in the middle of ordinary moments, it doesn't announce itself with noise, but with absence, the eerie sense that your life is unfolding without you fully in it. You go through the motions, hold conversations, fulfill responsibilities, but part of you watches from a detached place. The world feels dimmed, your emotions muted, your thoughts mechanical. People describe it as living in a dream they can't wake up from, as though they've become actors in their own lives, reading lines from a script they no longer believe in. The laughter sounds right, but doesn't feel right. The memories seem intact, but carry no emotional weight. You begin to wonder, am I disappearing? Depersonalization is not about forgetting who you are. It's about losing touch with the feeling of being who you are. Your body moves, your voice speaks, but something central feels missing, a loss not of identity, but of presence, and perhaps more frightening than the disconnection itself is the fear that it will never end. This state often emerges as a coping mechanism. In the face of overwhelming emotion, especially fear or grief, the mind steps back, it detaches, numbs, separates, not to harm you, but to protect you. It creates a buffer between your awareness and the pain that threatens to undo you. In the short term, this distance can be a survival strategy, but over time, it becomes its own form of suffering. Living in depersonalization is like floating in a sensory fog. Food tastes less vivid. Music sounds hollow. Physical touch feels muted. Even your own voice can seem foreign, as though someone else is speaking through you. You may feel like a ghost haunting your own life, tracing the outline of who you used to be. And yet you function. You go to work. You answer texts. You smile in photos. From the outside you appear fine, competent, stable, maybe even thriving. But inside, a silent crisis unfolds. A question echoes, if I don't feel real, what am I? The terrifying part is that others may not notice. Depersonalization is invisible, and because it lacks visible symptoms, those who suffer from it often feel isolated, misunderstood, or dismissed. You try to explain the sensation and people say, that's just anxiety. But it's more than that. It's an existential erosion, a rupture in the sense of self. But here is the quiet truth. Depersonalization is not a life sentence. It is a signal, a message from the psyche saying, I've endured too much. I've held in too long. I need to disconnect to survive. And beneath the numbness, beneath the disconnection, there is a longing, not just to feel again, but to return. The path back begins not with force, but with gentleness. You cannot think your way out of depersonalization. You must feel your way back. Slowly, softly, through grounding, through presence, through the quiet rebuilding of the relationship between your mind and your body. Begin with small acts of noticing, the sensation of your feet on the floor, the rhythm of your breath, the warmth of a cup in your hand. These are not cures, they are invitations, they are reminders to your nervous system that it is safe to return. And when the fear comes, because it will meet it with compassion, you are not broken, you are not fading. You are healing from a fracture that cannot be seen but is deeply felt. And healing is not linear. It is slow. It is uneven. But it is possible. Speak to someone. Share your experience. Even if it sounds strange, find language for the disconnection. Even if the words feel too small. Connection, even imperfect connection, helps knit the fabric of self back together. It reminds you that you are not alone in the fog. In time, moments will return. Moments when you feel the sun on your skin, and it registers as real. When laughter rises and it feels like yours. When you look in the mirror, and something in your eyes reflects back, not just an image but a knowing, a presence, a self. And that self, though shaken, was never truly gone. It was waiting, watching, holding on. Take a breath. You are not your disconnection. You are the awareness beneath it, the will to stay, the hope to return, the quiet strength it takes to keep walking through the fog, even when the road is uncertain. Next, we turn our gaze toward a different kind of withdrawal, not from the self, but from the world. When despair deepens and meaning dissolves, when nothing feels worth reaching for anymore. Segment 21. Existential apathy. When life feels emotionally weightless, there is a silence that does not comfort, a stillness not born from peace, but from absence. A flat horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, offering nothing and demanding nothing. Time passes, yet you feel unmoved. You wake, work, walk, sleep, but it all feels the same. You are not in pain. Not exactly, but you are not alive either. You exist in a liminal state where life continues but meaning has left the room. This is existential apathy, a hollow space where once there was striving, passion, and care. It's not always loud like depression. It doesn't always arrive with tears or agony. Sometimes it slips in so quietly that you don't even notice it at first. The joy you used to feel becomes dulled. Your dreams feel irrelevant. You stop asking questions not because you found the answers, but because you no longer care to know them. There was once a fire, a desire to achieve, to connect, to explore. But now, it's as though the logs are still there, the structure intact, but the flame has disappeared. You remember wanting things. You remember feeling urgency. But now, everything floats in a kind of emotional suspension. Not heavy, not light, just weightless. This emotional void is different from sadness. Sadness has texture. It carries memory. It implies longing. But apathy is formless. It is the absence of longing. A vacuum. You don't cry because there's nothing left to grieve. You don't celebrate because there's nothing left to win. You simply endure. One moment after the next, without color, without music. Existential apathy often arises when the pillars that once gave our lives structure begin to feel hollow. Work becomes repetitive, relationships stagnate, personal growth stalls, and in the quiet that follows, you begin to question why you're doing any of it. Why get out of bed? Why pursue anything? What does it all amount to? Some might say you're burned out, others might say you're ungrateful. But neither explanation quite touches the core of it. Because this is not about exhaustion or privilege. This is about meaning, or rather the sudden absence of it. A loss so deep and disorienting that it can only be felt, not easily explained. Philosophers have wrestled with this for centuries. Camus called it the absurd, the tension between our search for meaning and the silent, indifferent universe. Sartre spoke of nausea, that existential realization of our own freedom and isolation. In these moments of apathy, we feel both the weight of our freedom and the weightlessness of our purpose. You might feel guilty for feeling this way. After all, your life may appear fine from the outside. You have food, shelter, people, and yet none of it feels like it matters. That guilt can deepen the void, as though you're failing at life by not feeling grateful for it. But you are not failing. You are not broken. You are facing one of the most profound human experiences, the confrontation with emptiness. The place where the old reasons no longer suffice, and the new ones have yet to emerge. This space is terrifying, yes, but it is also fertile. In the stillness, there is the possibility of rediscovery, not through forcing meaning, but through noticing it in unexpected places. In the pattern of light on your wall, in the way a tree holds its shape in the wind, in the softness of your own breath, rising and falling. The return of meaning is not a thunderclap, it is a whisper. It does not demand action, only attention. And it comes when you stop trying to manufacture it and begin to listen. Sometimes the way forward is not to fix the apathy, but to honor it, to sit beside it, to ask what it is protecting you from. Because apathy is often a shield built after too many disappointments, too much striving without reward. It tells us, don't care, it hurts too much. And so we obey, until the silence becomes unbearable. And then perhaps we take one small step, not out of inspiration, but out of curiosity. What if something still matters? What if the numbness is not the end, but a waiting room? We begin again, not with grand plans, but with presence, with the willingness to meet the day without expectation, to say yes to small things, a song, a conversation, a walk, not because it will fix you, but because it might move you. And slowly, movement returns, a flicker of interest, a question, a stirring, not every day, not predictably, but enough to remind you that apathy is not a permanent state. It is a crossing, a passage through which the self travels when its old compass no longer points toward anything real. You are not lost, you are in between. Between what used to drive you and what might yet call to you again. Take this moment to breathe, to feel the weightlessness for what it is, not emptiness, but openness, not despair, but pause. Life is not asking you to feel joy right now. It is only asking you to remain, to witness, to trust that feeling may return, slowly, and that meaning may rise from unexpected soil. Next we examine a darker impulse born from this very void, not the absence of desire, but the compulsion to destroy. When the lack of meaning breeds not reflection, but sabotage. Segment 22. Psychological nihilism. When despair turns against the world, there is a silence more violent than rage. The moment when the soul goes quiet, not out of peace, but because it has stopped believing, not only in itself, but in everything. It is a slow unraveling, a quiet corrosion of the structures that once held life together. What begins as numbness curdles into resentment. What begins as disconnection deepens into disdain. This is psychological nihilism, a state where despair no longer sits quietly within, but begins to turn outward. Nihilism is not just the belief that life has no meaning. It is the experience of meaninglessness becoming heavy, sharp, and volatile. It is the internal chaos projected onto the world. A disillusionment so profound that even beauty feels like mockery, and kindness feels like a trick. There's a sense that everything is performative, constructed, empty. At the heart of psychological nihilism is pain, deep, unprocessed pain. Often it is born from betrayal, abandonment, systemic failure, or the repeated realization that sincerity is not always met with reciprocity. Somewhere along the line, the psyche stops hoping. And in that vacuum, it starts to tear things down. Where existential apathy leaves you weightless, psychological nihilism roots you in a kind of dark certainty. You begin to believe that not only is life empty, but attempts to find meaning are naive or deluded. You may scoff at rituals, question love, resent optimism. You may find yourself drawn to destruction, not always physically, but ideologically. You want to break what others still believe in, not because you're cruel, but because their hope makes your despair feel lonelier. In its darkest form, this can lead to deep misanthropy, a distrust of others, a loathing of humanity, a wish to see systems collapse. Not because it's fun, but because you can't stand the hypocrisy. You've looked behind the curtain, seen how hollow everything feels, and now you want everyone else to see it too. But even here, beneath the fire and fury, is grief, a longing so old it's calcified into cynicism. You didn't start out wanting to destroy. You started out wanting to believe. You wanted to belong, to love, to belove. And somewhere something broke that belief. The nihilism rose in self-defense. Better to feel nothing than to be hurt again. Better to destroy meaning than to be crushed by its absence. And yet the most dangerous thing about psychological nihilism is that it can feel powerful. In a world that celebrates meaning, rejecting it can feel like rebellion, like clarity, like control. But that control is an illusion. Because underneath the defiance is a soul still starving for connection. It's tempting to stay here, to wear your detachment as armor, to wield your disbelief like a weapon, to sit in the shadows and critique the light. But critique is not creation, and despair is not destiny. The path out of psychological nihilism is not paved with answers but with honesty. To admit that underneath the disdain is a wound, that behind the need to dismantle is the desire to feel whole again. And that takes more courage than cynicism ever will. You don't need to force belief. You don't need to pretend the world is beautiful. But you can start by letting it be, by letting others believe, by softening the impulse to mock, and instead becoming curious. What are they seeing that I cannot? What would it take for me to feel something real again? Maybe it's not in grand revelations but in tiny human things. A song, a touch, a silence shared without explanation. You don't have to rebuild the whole structure of meaning overnight. You only have to stop tearing it down long enough to see what might remain. It's okay to be angry, to be hurt, to question everything. But if you find yourself trying to prove that nothing matters, ask yourself, who are you trying to convince? The world? Or the part of yourself that still hopes something might? The fire inside you is not evil. It's unheld grief. Let it burn not to destroy, but to illuminate. Let it show you where the wounds are. And then, slowly, let it warm you again. And when warmth does begin to return, perhaps in laughter you didn't expect, or tears that come without warning, let it be the proof that you are still here. Still capable. Still human. This humanity, fragile, flawed, unfinished, is more powerful than all the cynical philosophies we wear like armor. It is the part of you that still aches, that still wants, and that wanting, no matter how small, is sacred. Nihilism can convince you that wanting is weakness, but it is not. It is aliveness. The crack through which new meaning enters. To want is to be willing to suffer again. And that, more than anything, is bravery. Take a breath. You are not lost. You are burning through the lies you were told, and the lies you began to tell yourself. And when the smoke clears, you may see that even in ruin, something remains. A spark. A question. A faint echo of belief. Next we move to a place more hidden, more subtle, where destruction is not loud but quiet, where the soul doesn't rebel but vanishes, when nothing inside you rises to fight because nothing feels worth the fight. Segment 23. Learned Dissociation. The soul's quiet escape. There is a kind of vanishing that doesn't involve footsteps. A slow erasure not of presence but of participation. You're still there, sitting at the dinner table, nodding in conversations, walking through your days, but you've disappeared from yourself. There is no rebellion, no visible collapse, only silence. This is learned dissociation. Not an escape you plan, but one your mind perfects to keep you safe. Dissociation is often misunderstood. People imagine it as dramatic or rare, but in truth, it's a subtle, widespread psychological defense. It begins as a kindness, a way of shielding yourself from pain too large to hold. When emotions become overwhelming, grief too sharp, fear too loud, memories too cruel, the mind retreats. It pulls you out of the moment and places you elsewhere. Somewhere quieter, somewhere duller, somewhere numb. At first it feels like relief, like floating above the world, untouched by its sharp edges. You go to school, you answer emails, you attend birthdays, and all the while, a part of you watches from behind glass, detached, protected, distant. But what protects also isolates. What shields also severs. And over time you forget how to return. Learned dissociation is what happens when temporary retreat becomes a lifestyle. When avoidance becomes identity. It's not that you don't want to feel, it's that you've forgotten how. You avoid mirrors because they feel too real. You avoid eye contact because it asks too much. You smile without warmth. You touch without intimacy. You function, but only barely. The roots of dissociation often stretch deep into childhood, trauma, emotional neglect. Moments when you needed to be seen, but weren't. When you needed comfort, but met only confusion. When your pain had no witness, and so your mind became its own hiding place. You built walls not out of malice, but out of necessity. And the longer you lived behind those walls, the more normal they felt. To the outside world, you may appear calm, controlled, even capable. But inside, there's a disconnection, like someone dimmed the lights and forgot to turn them back on. You respond, but not from your core. You speak, but don't always recognize the voice. You remember events, but not how they felt. Your memories become facts, not stories. Cold data with no emotional temperature. This is the soul's quiet escape. Not a scream, but a sigh. Not a break, but a slow, sustained drift. And yet you long to return. Somewhere inside, there's a flicker, a sense that life could feel fuller, that colors could return, that laughter might ring true again. You remember what connection used to feel like. You ache for it. But the bridge between here and there feels impossibly long. What makes learned dissociation so insidious is how adaptive it seems. You avoid pain, yes, but also joy. You sidestep conflict, but also intimacy. You numb fear and love with it. In seeking to escape suffering, you also escape vitality. But here's the truth. Your dissociation was never the problem. It was the solution. It kept you going. It bought you time. It helped you survive a reality that wasn't safe for your full presence. It deserves gratitude, not shame. Now the task is not to erase it, but to outgrow it. Returning to presence is not a leap. It is a series of small permissions to feel your breath, to notice your hands, to speak your name out loud and hear its echo in a quiet room, to let your body know, we are safe now, you can come back. This work is slow, and it must be slow. You are not rushing into feeling, you are learning how to be with it. You are reclaiming the moments you once had to abandon. And that is sacred work. Sometimes it begins with sensation, the warmth of sunlight on your arm, the cool texture of fabric, the rhythm of your footsteps on pavement. These aren't just physical experiences, they're gateways, ways to re-enter the present without overwhelm, without fear. And sometimes, the emotions come back too quickly. You feel sadness flood your chest with no warning. or fear grips your stomach like a vice. Do not see this as failure. It is your nervous system waking up. It is proof you are alive. You may cry for reasons you don't understand. You may laugh and feel strange doing it. Let these moments happen. Let them be awkward, raw, real, because they are yours. And they mean your soul is no longer just surviving. It is beginning to return. And if the numbness lingers longer than you want it to, be patient. The body does not forget, but it forgives slowly. Trust in that slow forgiveness. Speak your truth, even if it trembles. Tell someone, I feel far away. I feel like I'm watching my life, instead of living it. These words are not admissions of weakness. They are keys. They open doors. They invite others into your healing. And in time you will find that the distance shortens. The space between you and your body, you and your memories, you and your voice. You will feel the moment you laugh and mean it. You will feel the moment you touch and connect. You will feel the moment you return. Take a breath now. Feel the weight of your body in the room. This is not just a script. This is not just a concept. This is you present, real, and here. Next, we explore what happens when the mind doesn't just distance from pain, but begins to rewrite it. When the truth itself becomes fluid, and our memories serve not reality, but protection. Segment 24. False memories. When the mind rewrites the past, to survive memory is not a photograph. It is not a perfect static image preserved forever in the same shape. It is more like a painting, touched and retouched with each recollection. Each time you return to it, something changes. A brushstroke added here, a color slightly shifted there. The mind, in its search for coherence and safety, edits the past, sometimes gently, sometimes drastically, and sometimes it doesn't just soften the edges, it reinvents them. This is the phenomenon of false memories. False memories are not lies. They are not inventions made out of malice or deceit. They are psychological constructions, built over time through emotion, suggestion, trauma, and repetition. They feel real because they serve a purpose. They make the unbearable feel bearable. They give shape to chaos. They offer comfort or distance, or a coherent story when life has become too jagged to hold in raw form. You may recall a childhood moment of comfort that never happened, a parent tucking you in lovingly when in truth they were absent. Or you may remember being the cause of a family rupture, blaming yourself for something far more complex. These distortions aren't flaws of memory, they are strategies of survival. The mind protects what the heart cannot yet process. In trauma, this rewriting often intensifies. When events are too painful, too disorienting, or too shameful, the psyche steps in, not to erase, but to reorganize, to shield you from the full brunt of impact. You may forget entire events, or you may replace them with altered versions that feel safer to live with. Sometimes you only remember fragments, flashes of light, sound, or emotion, stitched together into a story that feels complete, even if it's not accurate. But false memories are not limited to trauma. They can also emerge from repeated suggestion, storytelling, or even dreams. A sibling tells a story often enough, and it becomes yours. A photo triggers a sensation you didn't know you had, and you begin to believe it as memory. The brain, always eager to create a coherent narrative, fills in the blanks, and once filled, those blanks harden. They feel real. They become yours. This is not a failure. This is humanity. The implications are complex. On one hand, it's humbling to realize that memory is so malleable that we cannot always trust our most intimate recollections. That what we believe to be true may only be a version of truth, edited over years. On the other hand, it's a revelation. Memory is not merely about accuracy. It's about meaning. The stories we tell ourselves about the past shape how we live in the present. If you believe you were always unlovable, that belief might be rooted in memories your mind curated to match a narrative. If you believe you were always safe, it might be because your mind buried what was dangerous. These internal stories govern the shape of your identity, and to question them can feel like pulling a thread in a tightly knit sweater. What unravels when we stop believing in the past we've built? And yet, healing requires just that. Not the rejection of memory, but the openness to examine it. To ask, what might I be protecting? What stories have I clung to, not because they're true, but because they feel necessary? This is not about blaming yourself for having false memories. It's about honoring the intelligence of the mind. Its willingness to adapt, to guard, to build a scaffold around the tenderest parts of you. And it's about deciding with care when that scaffold is no longer needed. The work of healing often involves revisiting the past, but not all at once, and not with the goal of absolute accuracy. Sometimes it's enough to hold a memory loosely, to say, this is how I remember it, but I am open to discovering more, to finding new angles, to hearing other voices, to letting go of the versions that hurt more than they help. In this process, grief will rise. You may grieve what you once believed to be true. You may grieve the parts of yourself that were hidden by the stories you told to survive. But that grief is sacred. It means you're ready to live with more clarity, more honesty, more light, and clarity does not always mean certainty. Sometimes it means learning to live with questions, to accept that the past may never be fully known, but that its impact can still be understood. That healing doesn't require perfect memory, only courageous attention. False memories are not signs of failure. They are signs of resilience. They are the footprints of a mind doing what it must to carry on. And now with gentleness, you can begin to revise again, not to deceive, but to invite your full self back into the story. Take a breath. You are not your past. You are not even your memories of your past. You are the meaning you choose to make now. And you are allowed to change the story, not to erase it but to understand it anew. Next, we explore what happens when our mind doesn't just edit our own stories, but the intentions and experiences of others. When we begin to project shadows onto the world around us. Segment 25, Projection. When the mind paints the world with its own wounds, sometimes the world feels like a mirror. You look out, and what you see reflects something buried deep within. A scowl from a stranger becomes proof that you're unlikable. A delay in a text response confirms you're being rejected. A neutral tone in someone's voice starts to sound like resentment. But often these interpretations say more about our internal landscape than the reality before us. This is projection, the quiet way our psyche casts its unhealed wounds onto the canvas of the world. Projection is the mind's defense against discomfort. Instead of confronting something difficult within, a shame we can't face, an anger we fear, a fear we can't name, we displace it. We see it in others. In their actions, their words, their silence, we externalize the parts of ourselves we can't yet hold. It's not a flaw, it's a survival instinct. When we feel overwhelmed, our psyche seeks relief, and one of the fastest ways to reduce internal tension is to unconsciously hand it off to someone else. You make me feel this way, we think. But often the feeling began before they even entered the room. Projection shows up in subtle ways. The friend we suddenly distrust without evidence. The partner whose affection starts to feel like control. The colleague whose confidence triggers irritation. These moments seem grounded in reality, but they may actually be distortions, filtered through old wounds, past betrayals, unmet needs. What makes projection so powerful is that it feels real. The emotional charge is genuine. The reaction is visceral, and yet if we pause long enough, we might begin to notice patterns. The same narratives playing out with different people. The same fears coloring different conversations. A familiar emotional loop disguised as something new. The roots of projection often go deep. Perhaps you were told explicitly or subtly that your anger was unacceptable, so now you flinch when others raise their voice. Or maybe you were shamed for needing too much. So now when someone leans in with care, you see them as needy. Your past becomes the lens through which you interpret the present, often without knowing you've put on the glasses at all. In intimate relationships, projection can be especially corrosive. We assign motives, assume intentions, read into silences. We treat our partner not as they are, but as the sum of our past experiences. A careless word echoes a childhood dismissal. A delayed response reactivates abandonment. And unless we become conscious, we start reacting not to them, but to our history. But there's a moment of grace available to us. A moment where we can pause and ask, is this really about them? Or is this something old that has risen again in new clothes? The work of healing projection is not about blame. It's about curiosity. When a reaction feels outsized, when your judgment feels too sharp, ask gently, what might this be reminding me of? What am I protecting? What am I afraid to feel? This is not easy. It requires the willingness to look inward when everything in you wants to point outward. It demands humility. And above all, it asks for self-compassion. Because whatever you're projecting was once too much to hold alone. And perhaps still is. To work with projection is to become more intimate with yourself. To notice your inner world before it spills out onto others. To feel anger and say, this belongs to me. To feel fear and say, this is old. To reclaim your experience as yours, not as evidence against the people around you. And as you do, something softens. You begin to see people more clearly. Not as threats, not as saviors, but as humans. Imperfect, separate, real. And in that clarity, connection deepens. Conflict becomes less about defense and more about understanding. Relationships become less about reenactment and more about presence. You also start to see yourself differently. Not as a fragile being whose feelings must always be explained by someone else's behavior, but as a whole person capable of holding complexity, capable of sitting with discomfort, capable of healing. It's okay if you don't always catch yourself in time. We all project. We all misinterpret. The goal is not perfection. It's awareness. To circle back and say, I think that was mine. To own your story without making others carry it. In time, the world begins to feel less hostile, not because it changed, but because your perception did. You trust your emotions more, not because they're always right, but because you understand them. You no longer fear your past, because you've integrated it. And when projection does arise, you meet it not with shame, but with gentleness. Take a breath. What are you seeing in others that might belong to you? What judgment feels familiar, not because it's true, but because it once protected you? These questions are not accusations. They are invitations to look inward, to return home. Next, we explore a closely linked phenomenon, one where the boundaries of influence blur even further, where we no longer just see ourselves in others, but begin to absorb their emotional states as if they were our own. Segment 26. Emotional enmeshment. When your feelings aren't yours anymore, it begins with care, quiet, genuine, instinctive. You want to help. You want to understand. You lean in, heart open, listening fully. But somewhere along the way, the line begins to blur. Their sadness becomes your heaviness. Their anxiety tingles in your chest. Their silence feels like your failure. And without realizing it, you are no longer witnessing someone else's experience. You are carrying it. This is emotional enmeshment, a state where the boundaries between self and other begin to dissolve, where empathy becomes over-identification, where support turns into self-erasure. It's not always dramatic. Often it feels like love, like closeness, like loyalty. But beneath that warmth is a subtle confusion. Whose feelings are these? Whose needs am I responding to? Where do I end and they begin? Enmeshment can form in any close relationship, parent and child, partners, friends. It often begins early, in homes where emotional roles were reversed or blurred. A child might grow up attuned to a parent's moods, learning that their safety depends on keeping someone else emotionally stable. Over time, they become hyper-vigilant. They scan every room for tension. They measure their worth by how well they can soothe others. And that pattern, once learned, is hard to unlearn, because it works until it doesn't. In enmeshed dynamics, your identity becomes fused with the emotional state of someone else. Their disappointment feels like your personal failure. Their joy becomes your purpose. Their silence triggers panic, not because they've said something harmful, but because you've lost your anchor. The hardest part is that it feels noble. You tell yourself, I'm just being supportive. I'm just a good listener. I'm just trying to help. But underneath, there's a deeper truth. You've learned to neglect yourself in order to stay close. You've learned that presence equals absorption. That love means merging. But love is not the absence of boundaries. It is the honoring of them. When you are enmeshed, your own emotional signals start to fade. You struggle to identify what you actually feel, separate from those around you. You second-guess your needs, fearing they'll disrupt someone else's peace. You become a mirror, reflecting everyone but yourself. This kind of living is exhausting. You may feel drained, overwhelmed, reactive. You may find yourself swinging between emotional over-involvement and emotional withdrawal, giving too much and then pulling all the way back. It's not because you're unstable, it's because your system is overloaded. You've been running on borrowed emotions. To step out of enmeshment is to begin remembering yourself, not in opposition to others, but in relation to your own truth. It starts with noticing when you begin to leave your body, your center, your clarity. It starts with asking simple but radical questions. Is this mine? Do I want to carry this? Am I responding or absorbing? And it requires permission, permission to disappoint, permission to detach without abandoning, permission to feel your own emotions, even when they're different from the ones in the room. You are allowed to feel joy when others feel sorrow. You are allowed to rest when others are struggling. You are allowed to speak your truth, even when it brings discomfort. These are not betrayals. They are boundaries. And boundaries are the architecture of real intimacy. Because in true connection, each person remains whole. Each person stands in their own experience while reaching toward the other. You do not need to lose yourself to love. You do not need to suffer in sync to prove loyalty. As you begin to disentangle, guilt may arise. Old scripts will echo. You're selfish. You're cold. You're abandoning them. Let those voices speak, then gently question them. Where did you learn that closeness requires sacrifice? Who taught you that your needs are too much? And then offer yourself new language. Closeness without collapse. Empathy without absorption. Presence with boundaries. This is the path back. You will make mistakes. You will sometimes overstep or pull too far back. That's okay. This is the work of a lifetime. Not perfection, but practice. And with each step, you reclaim something sacred, your own emotional sovereignty. The world may not always affirm this boundary work. Some people may resist, especially if they benefited from your self-abandonment. They may call it distance. They may call it cold, but clarity is not cruelty. And differentiation is not detachment. The more you root in your own emotional landscape, the more capable you become of true connection, not rooted in performance or sacrifice, but in mutual recognition. You as you are, them as they are, no merging, no losing, just meeting. And from that grounded place, you will see others more clearly, not as emotional weather to brace against, but as beings walking beside you, sometimes in storm, sometimes in sun, but always separate, always sovereign. Take a breath now, feel the ground beneath you. Return to your own body, your own breath, your own heartbeat. These are yours. This is home. And from that home, you can meet others, not as their savior, not as their shadow, but as yourself. Next, we move into the deeper layers of these blurred identities, where enmeshment grows into something more all-consuming. When you no longer adapt to others' emotions, but become defined by them. Segment 27, Identity Fusion. When your sense of self is swallowed by belonging, it begins with longing, the tender ache to be part of something larger than yourself. A cause, a person, a group that offers certainty, purpose, belonging. You lean in. You say yes. You commit, not just with your words, but with your identity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you stop standing beside the thing you love and start dissolving into it. This is identity fusion. It is more than loyalty, more than devotion. It is psychological absorption, a merging of self and system, self and other, until the boundaries blur and eventually disappear. You no longer say, "I believe in this." You say, "This is who I am." On the surface, it may look like passion, the committed partner, the devoted follower, the loyal member of a movement. You become someone who stands for something, but the standing becomes clinging, and the clinging becomes erasure. In identity fusion, your sense of worth, truth, and direction become indistinguishable from the collective or individual you are attached to. You no longer evaluate ideas critically, you defend them instinctively. Any challenge to the group becomes a threat to your existence. Disagreement feels like betrayal. Dissent feels like danger, because the line between me and them is gone. This fusion can be seductive. It offers clarity in a chaotic world. It simplifies identity. It relieves you from the burden of personal uncertainty. You know where you belong. You know what to think. You are part of something, and in being part, you feel whole. But that wholeness is fragile, because it depends on alignment, on agreement, on harmony with the external source of meaning. And when cracks appear, when the group disappoints, when the person changes, when the cause becomes questionable, you feel personally shattered. Not just disillusioned, but disoriented. If they are not who you thought they were, then who are you? Identity fusion often arises from unresolved wounds, loneliness, rejection, the pain of feeling unseen. When your individuality has been fragmented by trauma, fusion offers a quick repair, but it is a repair built on surrender, not integration. You trade complexity for certainty. You give up your inner compass for someone else's map. This is not weakness. This is longing, unmet and unanswered, turning into submission. You may find yourself saying yes when you mean no. You may sacrifice values to maintain harmony. You may mirror others so completely that you forget what your own reflection looks like. And when someone questions the group, the ideology, the relationship, you may lash out, not in anger but in fear. Because to defend it is to defend yourself. In close relationships, identity fusion can look like devotion, but underneath there is dependency. You adopt their moods, echo their beliefs, anticipate their reactions before they speak. You feel guilt for wanting space. You fear abandonment at the thought of differentiation. You no longer know how to say, "This is mine, and that is yours." To unfuse is painful. It means stepping back from what once felt like home. It means rediscovering your voice after years of echo. It means questioning not just others, but the parts of yourself that sought fusion in the first place. But in that questioning is the beginning of liberation. You do not have to renounce love, connection, or shared purpose. You only have to remember that you are whole before you are part. That your identity is not a product of affiliation, but of integration. That you can believe deeply without dissolving entirely. This path requires solitude, not isolation, but reflection. Time to ask, what do I think? What do I value? What would I choose, even if no one else approved? At first the answers may come slowly, haltingly. But over time, they grow roots. You find that you are not just a vessel for a cause or a relationship, you are a self. A self that can stand beside others, not inside them. A self that can love without losing. A self that can walk away when necessary, even if it breaks your heart. And when you do return, to the group, the partner, the purpose, you do so with clarity. You are there because you choose to be, not because you do not know who you are without it. And you will learn that your belonging does not have to cost your being. That your identity can align with others without being consumed by them. That you can collaborate without collapse. That the truest form of commitment is one born not from absorption, but from autonomy. There is peace in finding yourself again. A quiet courage in separating not from love, but from dependency. A deeper kind of connection born from clarity, not confusion. And when you reclaim that space, you rediscover a world that holds room for difference, where voices do not have to echo to be accepted. You learn that boundaries are not walls, but invitations to meet each other honestly. That love can stretch across space without having to fill it completely. Take a breath. Notice the places where your identity has fused with another's. Ask yourself if those bonds nourish or erase you. You are allowed to reclaim space. You are allowed to disagree. You are allowed to belong without disappearing. Next, we move toward the final layer of psychological surrender, when identity is not just merged with another person or group, but placed entirely in their hands. When control replaces connection, and loyalty becomes a leash. Segment 28. The cult effect. When manipulation masquerades as belonging, it does not always begin with control. Sometimes it starts with kindness, a welcoming smile, a warm invitation, words that make you feel special, seen, chosen. You enter a space and something inside you exhales. Here, you think, is where I belong. You do not yet realize that what feels like safety may become a structure built to contain, to constrain, to consume. The cult effect is not limited to religious groups or fringe movements. It exists in corporations, communities, relationships. It arises wherever psychological manipulation is cloaked in connection, where control is disguised as care, where devotion is demanded in exchange for worth. It begins subtly, with language that sets the group apart. We are not like them. Only we understand. Only we are awake. This narrative flatters you. It tells you that you are among the enlightened, that others will never understand, that dissent is ignorance, that doubt is weakness. At first, this feels empowering. You have found your people, your purpose, a structure that provides clarity. And in a world that often feels uncertain, clarity can feel like love, but clarity without freedom is not love. It is control. In time, the rules tighten. The expectations grow. Behavior is monitored. Questions are discouraged. Loyalty is praised, but it becomes a leash. You find yourself editing your words, your thoughts, your feelings. You are no longer just part of something. You are inside something that begins to shape who you are allowed to be. And the most dangerous part is that it still feels like belonging. Manipulative groups or individuals often use emotional intensity to create dependency. You are praised, uplifted, adored, but only when you conform. The moment you pull away, even slightly, the warmth turns cold. The love becomes shame. The connection becomes punishment. You are told you are ungrateful, lost, disloyal. This psychological coercion is not always loud. Often it is silent. A look, a pause, a communal withdrawal. The group does not need to shout to control you. It only needs to threaten to take its love away. Over time, you internalize the voice of the group. You begin to police yourself. You cut ties with outsiders. You sacrifice parts of your life and parts of yourself to stay in good standing. And eventually you forget where you end, and the group begins. This is the heart of the cult effect. Not just that you are manipulated, but that you begin to believe the manipulation is your own will. You justify the restrictions. You rationalize the losses. You call control loyalty. You call silence peace. You may even come to believe that life outside the group is dangerous or meaningless. The thought of walking away becomes synonymous with failure or betrayal. You begin to equate doubt with disloyalty. Curiosity becomes a threat, and so you stay. Not because you are fulfilled, but because fear has become your anchor. Leaving such a structure is not just a physical act. It is an emotional and existential upheaval. Because by the time you consider leaving, your identity is entangled in the very thing that is harming you. To walk away feels like losing your purpose, your people, yourself. But in truth, what you are losing is a system that taught you to conflate love with obedience. A system that offered you belonging only at the cost of your autonomy. And what you stand to gain is not just freedom, but selfhood. Recovery from the cult effect begins with a quiet awakening, a flicker of doubt that refuses to die, a whisper inside that asks, What if I am allowed to think for myself? What if belonging should not require my silence? What if love should not feel like fear? These questions are the beginning. They are terrifying, but they are sacred. They are the way back. You will grieve. Not just the people or the place, but the version of yourself that once believed so deeply that grief is real. Let it move through you. You are not weak for having been taken in. You are human. You longed for connection. You trusted, and now you are learning to trust again. This time not in a group but in yourself. As you disentangle, you may feel lost, untethered, but slowly you begin to hear your own voice again. Not the one shaped by ideology or pressure, but the quieter one, the one that speaks in questions, in wonder, in truth, and you begin to realize that true belonging does not ask you to disappear. True connection does not require conformity. True love does not punish your autonomy. It celebrates it. In the quiet aftermath, you may notice how much space returns to you. Space to think, to feel, to rediscover what was set aside. You begin to reassemble your own compass, piece by piece. And while that process is slow, it is also beautiful. You learn to be loyal not to systems, but to your inner truth. To choose connections that nourish, not control. To trust love that grows through freedom, not fear. You no longer need to earn your worth through sacrifice. You reclaim your right to exist, whole, questioning, alive. Take a breath. You have not failed. You are awakening. You are returning, not to who you were before, but to someone wiser, freer, deeper. Next we explore the final terrain in this psychological descent, when selfhood collapses entirely, and identity is reconstructed from the outside in. When the soul becomes the site of programming. Segment 29. Psychological conditioning. When the mind is rewired to obey, there is a moment, quiet, precise, when your choices no longer feel like choices, when your reactions are automatic, your preferences conditioned, your voice unfamiliar. You move through life as if driven by unseen commands. The smile, the nod, the step forward, the silence, all rehearsed, all reflex. This is not instinct. This is not intuition. This is psychological conditioning. The slow rewiring of the mind to obey. Unlike the dramatic conversions we associate with manipulation, psychological conditioning is gradual. It does not demand. It nudges. It does not scream. It repeats, a word here, a reward there, a punishment withdrawn, a smile bestowed. Over time you begin to adjust. You stop asking why. You learn the rules. You internalize the rhythm of compliance. This process is not always sinister. Conditioning is how we learn. It helps us survive. It shapes our behaviors from the moment we are born. But when used without consent, when applied with the intent to control rather than guide, it becomes something darker, something that erodes choice, something that replaces authenticity with performance. Imagine a child raised in a home where love is conditional. Praise is given for silence, for stillness, for obedience. Disapproval follows questioning. Over time, the child learns not just what to do, but who to be. The self becomes a product of reinforcement, sculpted by someone else's expectations, and this shaping does not stay in childhood. It follows you into relationships, into work, into the mirror. Conditioning teaches you what is acceptable, not just outwardly, but inwardly. You start to monitor your own thoughts. You censor your desires before they are fully formed. You become both subject and enforcer. The mind splits, one part trained, one part watching. This internal split can feel like safety, predictability, but beneath it lies loss. The loss of spontaneity, the loss of self-directed growth, the loss of inner freedom. You no longer know what you want. You only know what is wanted from you. And because the conditioning often comes through repetition and reward, it feels natural. You cannot trace when it began. There was no single moment of surrender, just 1,000 small adjustments, 1,000 silent negotiations. 1,000 times you told yourself, it is easier this way. But ease is not the same as peace. Comfort is not the same as clarity. And eventually, a tension begins to build. A quiet resistance. A feeling that something inside is pressing against the script. That your life has become a series of performances, and you do not know the director anymore. You may notice it in moments of stillness. When no one is watching. When there is no expectation to meet. Something rises, a forgotten impulse, a buried preference, a voice that sounds like your own. And it startles you, because it has been so long since you heard it. This is where the deconditioning begins. In the recognition that what has been rehearsed is not the whole truth, that you were shaped, and therefore can reshape. The process is slow, not because the conditioning is strong, but because the self underneath is gentle. It has waited patiently. It does not shout, it does not demand. It simply waits for you to turn inward. And when you do, it offers questions. What do I believe? What do I feel? What would I do if no one told me how? These are not easy questions, because the answers may threaten the structures you have built. They may disrupt relationships. They may unsettle identities. But they are necessary, because they return you to the source, the part of you that existed before the programming. You may begin to test new responses. Say no when you would have nodded. Speak when you would have stayed quiet. You may feel guilt. You may feel fear. That is the residue of conditioning. Let it rise. Let it pass. You might stumble at first. Fall into old habits. Catch yourself mid-sentence, wondering whose words you're using. That too is part of awakening. There is no neat break between who you were and who you are becoming. There is only the turning, the returning, the slow, patient unraveling of what never truly fit. Freedom does not come from defiance alone. It comes from remembering, from reclaiming, from choosing. There is no enemy to fight here, only a system to outgrow, only patterns to unlearn, only a self to rediscover beneath the scripts. And as you do, you begin to write new ones. Ones rooted not in fear, but in presence. Not in reward, but in resonance. Not in survival, but in truth. You may not always feel brave. That is all right. Bravery in this context is quiet. It is the soft resistance of choosing what aligns even when no one is clapping. It is the silent courage to feel what is real. Take a breath. You are not broken. You are not artificial. You are awakening. Your thoughts, your choices, your truths, they are still yours. Buried perhaps, but not lost. And with each new act of awareness, they grow stronger. Next we arrive at the final descent, when the mind no longer questions, and control is no longer hidden. When obedience becomes total. When submission becomes survival. Segment 30. Totalitarian Psychology. When the inner world mirrors a regime, there comes a point when the internal landscape no longer merely echoes external control. It becomes its own regime, not a metaphor, but a lived experience. A mind structured like a totalitarian state, rigid, watchful, inescapable. Here, obedience is not a choice, but a condition. Surveillance is not imposed from the outside, but generated within. There are no doors to walk through. Only endless corridors patrolled by fear. It begins with internalized rules, learned from childhood, society, authority figures. At first, they seem useful. Guidelines, guardrails, a way to navigate the world, but over time, they harden, they ossify, they evolve into mandates that tolerate no dissent. You find yourself policing your own thoughts, punishing your own impulses, silencing the part of you that questions, longs, resists. In totalitarian psychology, the self splits entirely. One part becomes the enforcer, the censor, the judge. The other becomes the subject, subdued, watched, corrected. Every thought passes through an invisible tribunal. Every emotion is interrogated. Why are you feeling this? What gives you the right? Are you loyal to the system you have built within? This state is not born of vanity or weakness, but of survival. Often, it begins in environments where unpredictability was dangerous, where conformity meant safety, where questioning authority, even silently, was met with punishment, rejection, or withdrawal of love. And so, the mind did what it had to do. It built an internal authority figure stronger than any external one, to stay ahead of pain, to control what could not be controlled. But the cost of this internal regime is enormous. Creativity suffocates. Curiosity dies. Joy becomes suspect. The imagination, once a playground, becomes a courtroom. You do not play anymore. You do not wonder. You calculate. You predict. You conform. Even your sense of self-worth is tied to loyalty to the internal regime. If you follow the rules, you are good. If you question them, you are dangerous. You begin to fear your own freedom. You exile the parts of you that seek change. You become a warden guarding a prisoner who looks just like you. This psychological structure mirrors actual totalitarian systems. The propaganda, the surveillance, the punishment of deviance, the glorification of sacrifice. But here, it plays out in your own nervous system, in your own breath, in the way you walk into a room and wonder who you are allowed to be. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is this: you may not even realize it is happening because it feels normal. It feels safe. It feels like the only way to survive. You tell yourself you are being responsible, moral, reasonable. But underneath that facade is a deeper truth. You are afraid of being free. You fear the collapse of the structure, because if you let go of the rules, what remains? Who remains, and can that version of you be loved, respected, protected? Unraveling a totalitarian psychology is not a rebellion. It is a grieving, a letting go of the system that kept you alive, but now keeps you small. It is an act of mourning for the years spent in service to a false order, for the dreams abandoned, for the voices silenced, for the self you locked away to make it through. It does not happen in a day. The regime does not fall with a declaration. It weakens in silence, in noticing. In moments when you choose presence over protocol, when you let yourself feel without explanation, when you speak a truth, even if it shakes, when you rest without permission. These are your quiet revolutions, and slowly, you begin to reclaim your inner territory. A breath at a time, a sentence at a time, a day without judgment, a decision made not from fear, but from freedom. You begin to notice beauty again, not as a distraction, but as proof that the world is wider than the rules you inherited, that you are capable of living beyond survival, that your inner world can be rebuilt, not as a regime, but as a refuge. Take a breath, feel what arises, do not correct it, do not contain it, just notice. That is how freedom begins. Not with a revolution, but with attention, with the willingness to stop watching yourself and start witnessing yourself instead. You are not a system, you are not a script, you are not a soldier, you are a being, capable of softness, of wildness, of peace. And as the internal regime dissolves, what remains is not chaos, but choice. Not weakness, but wonder. Not obedience, but presence. This is the end of the descent and the beginning of return. Not to who you were before all this, but to who you have always been beneath it. Because once the regime has crumbled, and the echoes of its orders fade, you find yourself standing in a vast silent clearing. No signs, no rules, just possibility. And that can be terrifying. But it is also the only place from which something truly new can be born. Here, you no longer need permission to feel, to question, to dream. The gate is open. You are no longer under surveillance. You are the sky, not the cage. You are the question, not the doctrine. You are the flame, not the command. Take one more breath. You are free.